There is a particular kind of soldier who is never remembered the way the great heroes are remembered. He is not remembered in statues outside Parliament buildings, or in the kind of films where a single man turns the tide with one impossible act of courage. He is remembered differently, quietly, grudgingly, in the margins of memoirs written by the men who spent years trying to defeat him. He is remembered in the frustration of Allied generals who had every advantage on paper and still could not break through. He is remembered in the mountains of Italy, in the cold stone of monastery walls, in the mud of river crossings that cost more than anyone had planned for. He is remembered not because he won, but because of how long and how intelligently and how stubbornly he refused to lose. That soldier was Albert Kesselring. His name does not carry the same instant recognition as Rommel or Guderian. It does not arrive wrapped in the mythology that history tends to build around generals who move fast and strike hard. Kesselring was something rarer and in many ways more difficult to understand. He was a commander who could hold. Who could look at a map of retreating front lines and crumbling allies and dwindling ammunition stocks and still find the seam that his enemy had not yet thought to press? He was called, by those who fought against him and those who fought beside him, the most capable defensive commander of the entire war in the West. That is not a title awarded lightly, but to reduce Albert Kesselring to a single role, to call him simply the master of defense and leave it there, is to misread the full shape of his life, because this was a man who began his military career not in the air, but in the traditional artillery of the Imperial German Army, a man who navigated the humiliation of German defeat in the First World War and the political chaos of the years that followed, a man who, in middle age, made one of the most unusual transitions in modern military history, from army officer to Air Force commander, at a time when military aviation was still raw and experimental and hotly contested as a concept, and who then rose, through a combination of administrative brilliance, political navigation, and genuine tactical instinct, to command one of the most powerful air fleets in the world. He would fly over Poland. He would direct the air war over France. He would sit at the center of the Battle of Britain, making decisions that would later be scrutinized for decades. He would serve on the Eastern Front, and then, when the tide of the war had turned and Germany's position in North Africa had become untenable, he would be handed the most thankless assignment a commander could receive: hold Italy. Not take it, not break through it, hold it, against an Allied force that had the sea on both sides, the air overhead, and eventually the full weight of American industrial production behind it. He would hold it for nearly 2 years. There is a reason that Allied commanders wrote about Kesselring with a mixture of admiration and exasperation that is almost unique in the literature of the Second World War. There is a reason that the campaign in Italy, which Allied planners had hoped to conclude in months, stretched into one of the longest and most grinding struggles of the entire conflict. That reason has a name. It has a face, broad, often smiling, almost incongruously cheerful for a man managing catastrophe. It has a biography that begins in Bavaria, in the final decades of the 19th century, and ends in a West German hospital more than 2 decades after the guns fell silent. And that biography is what we are here to follow tonight. This documentary will take you through the complete arc of Albert Kesselring's life and career, from the provincial Bavarian town where he was raised, through the trenches and bureaucratic corridors and airfields of 2 world wars, to the courtroom at Nuremberg, where he sat in the dock and defended the choices he had made, and finally to the quiet and contested question of what his legacy actually means. We will not flinch from the difficult chapters. There are war crimes trials in this story, There are decisions made under his command that resulted in reprisals against civilians. History does not allow us to look away from those, and neither will we. But we will also trace, with the same honesty, the full picture of a military mind that even his enemies acknowledged as exceptional. Because understanding Kesselring fully, the brilliance and the culpability together, not one excusing the other, is how we understand something important about the nature of military command in total war, about what it means to serve a regime you did not create but chose to remain loyal to, about how a man can be simultaneously a subject of genuine military admiration and a legitimate subject of moral reckoning. These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that matter. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. If you have settled in for a long evening, perhaps with the lights low and the particular kind of quiet that comes after the rest of the world has gone to sleep, then you have chosen a good night for it. The story of Albert Kesselring is long and layered, and it rewards the kind of unhurried attention that a night like this makes possible. There is no need to rush. We will move through his life the way the Italian campaign itself moved, carefully, with attention to the terrain, one line at a time. For those of you who have been with this channel before, you know what to expect. No shortcuts, no oversimplifications, no clean heroes and paper villains. Just the full weight of a life lived at the center of the most destructive conflict in human history, examined as honestly as the historical record allows. And if you are new here, if this is the documentary that found you on a restless night or a quiet afternoon, then take a moment to subscribe before we go any further. There is a great deal more where this came from. Long-form histories of the commanders, campaigns, and turning points that shaped the modern world, made for exactly this kind of careful, unhurried watching. Subscribe, settle in, and let the story carry you. Because we are about to go back to a Bavaria that no longer exists, in an empire that was already beginning to crack at its foundations. Back to a young man from a middle-class family who had no particular reason to become one of the most studied military commanders of the 20th century, and who became one anyway. His name was Albert Kesselring, and this is where it begins. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the Bavarian countryside in the hours before dawn. The forests hold their breath. The small towns along the river valleys sit undisturbed beneath the weight of stars, their church spires cutting upward into the darkness like compass needles pointed towards something fixed and certain. It is the kind of quiet that asks nothing of the people sleeping beneath its cover. But it is also the kind of quiet that can be shattered, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, in a single season, by forces far larger than any one man, or any one town, or any one country. Albert Kesselring was born into that quiet in the autumn of 1885, in the Bavarian town of Marktsteft, a place so small and unhurried that the rest of the world seemed to exist somewhere else entirely. He could not have known, in those early years, that the world would eventually arrive at his door, and that he would spend the better part of his adult life walking out to meet it. His family was solid, educated, and thoroughly Bavarian in the way that mattered in the final decades of the 19th century. His father held a position of modest public standing, and the Kesselring household valued discipline, learning, and the kind of ordered thinking that turned a boy's natural curiosity into something useful. There was no long military tradition pressing down on Albert from above, no grandfather's uniform hanging in the hallway, no unspoken expectation that a sword would eventually replace the schoolbooks. The path toward the army was chosen rather than inherited, and that distinction would matter later, because men who choose a profession tend to study it more carefully than those who simply step into it. Young Albert was a capable student, methodical in his thinking, and possessed of a temperament that was calm without being cold. Those who knew him in his youth described a boy who observed before he spoke, and who preferred to understand a problem fully before committing to a solution. Bavaria in the 1890s and early 1900s was a country within a country, technically part of the newly unified German Empire, but stubbornly particular about its own identity, its own customs, its own way of measuring a man's worth. The empire itself was still young, still inflating with the confidence of the Bismarck years and the rapid industrialization that had transformed Germany from a collection of competing principalities into a single formidable power. The army stood at the center of that transformation. It was not merely a fighting force. It was an institution, a culture, a system of values that shaped the men who passed through it, and through them, the broader society they returned to. When Kesselring entered the Bavarian military as a young officer candidate in the early years of the 20th century, he was not simply joining a branch of service. He was enrolling in a way of thinking about the world. His early training was thorough and demanding in the particular way that the German Imperial Army expected of its officers. The curriculum was not merely tactical, it reached into logistics, administration, engineering, and the science of moving large bodies of men and material across distances that could defeat an army before a single shot was fired. Kesselring absorbed all of it. He had a mind that was especially suited to the structural side of warfare, to the problem of how things fit together, how supply chains support front lines, how terrain shapes options, how the relationship between air and ground and logistics forms a single interconnected system rather than a series of separate departments. These were not fashionable ideas at the time. The prevailing instinct in most European armies at the turn of the century remained attached to the decisive frontal engagement, the massed charge, the breakthrough achieved by weight of numbers and force of will. Kesselring was already, even as a young officer, inclined to think differently. He served as an artillery officer in the years leading up to 1914, and that experience marked him in ways that would carry forward across decades. Artillery is, at its core, a science of indirect effect. You rarely see the target you are trying to destroy. You calculate, you estimate, you adjust based on information fed back to you by observers you must trust and tools you must understand. Success depends not on personal courage alone, but on coordination, communication, and the ability to synthesize information from multiple sources into a single coherent picture. These were lessons that transferred, almost perfectly, to the command of air forces. Long before Kesselring ever sat in an aircraft or gave orders to a wing of bombers, the artillery had already taught him how to think from above the battlefield rather than within it. When the First World War arrived in August of 1914, Kesselring was a young officer moving upward through a system that was about to be tested to the point of collapse. The early months of the war burned through officers at a rate that no one had anticipated. The casualty lists from the Western Front alone were so vast, so relentless, that the army was forced to promote men faster than the normal peacetime rhythms would have allowed. For officers who showed aptitude, the war became an accelerant. For those who did not, it became an ending. Kesselring showed aptitude. He served in operational roles that required him to manage complexity under pressure, to maintain clarity of thought when the information reaching him was incomplete, contradictory, or simply absent. The experience confirmed something he likely already suspected about himself, that he performed better as conditions worsened, that uncertainty sharpened rather than paralyzed him. By the middle years of the war, Kesselring had moved into staff work, a transition that would define the next phase of his career. Staff officers occupied a peculiar position in the German military hierarchy. They were neither the front commanders making decisions in the mud, nor the distant generals issuing orders from chateaux far behind the lines. They were the connective tissue between intention and execution, the men who translated the grand designs of senior commanders into workable operational plans and then tracked whether those plans were actually holding together as the enemy refused to cooperate. It was demanding, often thankless work. It required a man to be authoritative without being overbearing, precise without being rigid, and perpetually willing to revise his understanding of a situation that was constantly revising itself. Kesselring was suited to every part of it. The final years of the First World War brought a different kind of education, not the sharp lessons of early optimism colliding with reality, but the grinding, exhausting curriculum of a war that refused to end. Germany was contracting by 1917 and 1918, squeezed by the Allied blockade, bled white by years of attrition, and increasingly aware that the mathematics of the war were moving against her. Officers like Kesselring watched their country's situation deteriorate with the particular anguish of men who understood the operational picture clearly and could not look away from what it was telling them. The army was still fighting, still capable of tactical brilliance in isolated engagements, but the strategic reserves of men, of material, of time were running out. The armistice of November 1918 arrived not as a surrender on the battlefield, but as a collapse of the system behind it, a failure of national endurance rather than military will, or so many German officers would tell themselves in the years that followed. Kesselring was in his early 30s when the war ended, old enough to have formed definitive views about command and strategy, young enough to have a full career still ahead of him. The defeat left marks on him that were impossible to separate from his professional outlook. He was part of a generation of German officers who believed, with varying degrees of self-awareness, that the war had been lost by factors beyond the military's control, and that the army itself remained an institution of genuine merit, capable of more than the outcome of the conflict suggested. This belief was neither unique to Kesselring nor without some partial truth. But it was also the kind of belief that could lead a man to invest enormous energy in rebuilding a military capacity that the rest of the world had decided should not exist, because the argument that the army had been failed by everyone else was a difficult argument to abandon once it had taken root. What the war had given him, beyond rank and experience, was a quality that would prove decisive in everything that followed, the ability to hold a complicated situation in his head without letting complexity become an excuse for inaction. He had learned to manage uncertainty. He had learned to work across disciplines, supply, engineering, operations, air support, that most officers treated as separate concerns best handled by separate specialists. He had learned that the relationship between different arms of military power was not merely cooperative, but fundamentally interdependent, that weakness in one area could unravel strength everywhere else, and that a commander who failed to understand this would eventually be undone by the gap in his own understanding. These were not theoretical conclusions. They had been hammered into him, year by year, through the hardest kind of instruction there is. Bavaria was waiting for him when he came home. The same forests, the same river valleys, the same church spires. But the country was not the same. The empire was gone, replaced by a republic that was fragile in ways that only became fully visible with time. The army that had defined Kesselring's adult life had been reduced by treaty to a fraction of its former size, its ambitions officially curtailed, its purpose officially limited. For a man who had spent 15 years learning how to fight a modern industrial war, The post-war world offered a strange kind of professional suspension. Still in uniform, still drawing pay, still subject to military order, but operating inside a structure that was, by design, too small to do what armies actually exist to do. It would not remain that way. The suspension would end, and Albert Kesselring, patient and methodical as ever, would be there when it did. Germany in the early 1920s was a nation learning to live inside a wound that would not close. The armistice had been signed, the Kaiser had fled, and from the wreckage of empire a fragile republic had been assembled, uncertain, contested, and deeply unloved by the very military that was supposed to serve it. For a professional soldier like Albert Kesselring, these were years that demanded a particular kind of discipline, not the discipline of the battlefield, but the quieter, more difficult discipline of waiting. He had come through the First World War, with his abilities proven and his ambitions intact, and yet the world he returned to offered him precious little room to exercise either. The army he served, now stripped to a skeleton force of 100,000 men under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, was a constrained institution operating inside a constrained nation. Survival, for an officer of his rank and temperament, meant doing the work in front of him, however modest, and trusting that the work would eventually matter. He remained in the Reichswehr, the small professional army that replaced the old imperial force, and found himself navigating an institution defined as much by what it was forbidden to do as by what it was permitted. The restrictions imposed at Versailles were comprehensive and deliberate. No heavy artillery beyond certain limits, no tanks, no military aviation whatsoever. The victorious Allied powers had dismantled the German air arm completely, grounding an entire dimension of modern warfare and, in doing so, foreclosing the careers of an entire generation of officers who had built their identities around it. Kesselring had not been among the airmen. He was still, at this point, a staff officer and artillery specialist. But he watched the prohibition on aviation with the careful attention of a man who understood that what is suppressed does not disappear. It simply finds another shape. In the meantime, he applied himself to the administrative and organizational work of the Reichswehr with the same methodical energy he had brought to the front. Staff work in the Weimar years was unglamorous, but not unimportant. Kesselring moved through a series of posting and administrative roles that gave him an increasingly broad view of how a modern military force was assembled and sustained. He was not a man of narrow specialism. Where other officers clung to their branch expertise, infantry, cavalry, artillery, Kesselring showed a consistent appetite for the larger picture, logistics, organization, the relationship between different arms of service, the machinery behind the fighting. This breadth of perspective would prove to be one of the defining qualities of his command career, a quality that could only have been developed in exactly the kind of slow, unglamorous work the interwar years demanded. He was building knowledge the way a craftsman builds skill, through repetition, through problem-solving, through the accumulation of understanding that comes from never treating any task as beneath notice. Behind the visible structure of the Reichswehr, something else was being built in secret. Germany's military leadership had never truly accepted the limits imposed upon them, and through a series of covert arrangements, some conducted with Soviet cooperation, others hidden within civilian organizations and sporting associations, they began to rebuild the military capabilities that Versailles had prohibited. Aviation was central to this clandestine effort. German pilots flew and trained on foreign soil. Aircraft design continued inside companies whose public face was entirely civilian. Theoretical work on air warfare, tactical doctrine, and operational planning proceeded in parallel with the official prohibition, kept alive by officers and engineers who understood that the ban would not last forever and intended to be ready when it lifted. Kesselring became involved in the administrative and organizational dimensions of this effort, working within the system that was quietly, carefully building the foundation for a future German Air Force. His entry into aviation was not the romantic leap of a natural flyer. He had not grown up dreaming of the sky. He was a practical man, an organizer, and it was precisely in that capacity that the embryonic German air program needed him. The technical side of flying could be taught. The ability to think about air power as a component of large-scale military operations, to understand its relationship to ground forces, to logistics, to the movement of entire armies, that was rarer, and Kesselring had it. He took flying lessons and qualified as a pilot, an act of personal commitment to his new domain that was also, unmistakably, an act of professional pragmatism. He was not going to command airmen from the outside. He was going to learn their world from the inside, however late he had come to it. When Adolf Hitler came to power in the early 1930s and the National Socialist government began the open and accelerating rearmament of Germany, the covert program was finally brought into the light. The Luftwaffe was formally established, announced to a world that had suspected its existence for years, and the men who had been quietly building it were suddenly handed the task of constructing it at speed. Kesselring was among those transferred into this new branch of service, and his transition was neither smooth nor universally welcomed. He was an army man being handed a senior position in an air force, and there were those within the Luftwaffe who resented it. Career airmen who had spent years flying, who had devoted their professional lives to aviation while Kesselring was still counting artillery shells and reviewing supply tables, did not automatically accept him as one of their own. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's commanding officer and the political force behind its creation, had his own way of managing the institution he led. He was vain, politically calculating, and prone to favoritism, but he was also, in these early years, genuinely concerned with building an effective fighting force, and he recognized in Kesselring a quality that was rare in any military organization: the ability to take a bureaucratic and institutional problem and solve it practically. Göring gave Kesselring senior administrative responsibility, and Kesselring delivered results. The relationship between the two men was never one of warmth. Göring's personality made warmth difficult, and his ego made it risky, but it was professionally functional, and in the competitive world of Nazi Germany's military hierarchy, functional was more than sufficient. Kesselring applied himself to the task of building the Luftwaffe with the same systematic energy he had brought to every previous assignment. He oversaw the organization of air districts, the construction of infrastructure, the development of training programs, and the translation of theoretical doctrines into practical structures that real units could actually use. He was working on a canvas that was simultaneously enormous and incomplete. The Luftwaffe was being built from almost nothing, at pace, under political pressure, with all the improvisation and imperfection that such conditions produce. What Kesselring brought was a steadying hand, the ability to impose coherence on chaos, to establish systems where there had been none, and to make institutions work, even when they were being constructed around the people inside them. His relationships with the professional aviators beneath him evolved gradually. He was not a natural flyer in the sense of instinct and feel that defines the great pilots, and he never claimed to be one, but he flew, he studied, and, crucially, he listened. He understood that the men who had spent their careers in the cockpit possessed knowledge he would never fully replicate, and he was pragmatic enough to treat that knowledge as a resource rather than a threat to his authority. This quality, the willingness of a senior commander to genuinely learn from his subordinates, is rarer than it sounds, and it earned him a degree of respect among the Luftwaffe's flying officers that his initial appointment alone could never have secured. By the mid-1930s, the Luftwaffe was taking shape as a genuine fighting force, and Kesselring's role within it was no longer simply administrative. He was beginning to influence doctrine, to think seriously about how air power should be used in the kind of fast-moving, combined arms warfare that German military theorists were increasingly championing. He engaged with the ideas being developed around him, the integration of ground and air, the use of bombing to break enemy command and communication, the role of air superiority in enabling ground operations, and began to develop his own understanding of these concepts, tested against his experience managing the institutions that would have to execute them. His thinking was never that of a pure theorist. It was always grounded in the question of what was actually achievable, given real resources, real constraints, and real human beings. What the interwar years gave Kesselring, ultimately, was something that combat alone could never have provided. They gave him an understanding of how modern military power is built, sustained, and administered. He had watched a nation rebuild its military capacity from near nothing under conditions of secrecy and external pressure. He had helped construct an air force from the ground up. He had navigated a political military environment of extraordinary complexity, serving three very different regimes, managing relationships with powerful and difficult personalities, and maintaining his own professional integrity through institutional turbulence that destroyed lesser careers. None of it had been spectacular. Very little of it had been the kind of thing that appears in campaign histories. But it was foundational, and when the war that was being quietly prepared finally arrived, Kesselring would be among the few senior commanders who understood not just how to fight with the instruments of modern war, but how those instruments had been forged. He entered the late 1930s as a man whose career seemed improbable in retrospect. A former artillery officer turned Air Force administrator, commanding one of the major air fleet formations of a newly rebuilt force, preparing for a conflict that the government he served had been engineering with patient, ruthless deliberation. The ridicule of early skeptics had long since evaporated. His reputation had been built without drama, without a single defining moment of heroism or inspiration, but built firmly nonetheless, in the way that reliable things tend to be built, through sustained competence, through the accumulation of demonstrated capability, and through the quiet, unglamorous refusal to fail at whatever task was placed in front of him. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation simultaneously unraveling and reinventing itself. The Weimar Republic, wounded by economic catastrophe and political fracture, gave way to something harder and far more dangerous. And within the institutions that were quietly reassembling themselves beneath the surface of civilian life, Albert Kesselring found his footing in a way that the old imperial army had never quite allowed. He was not a young man chasing glory. He was a methodical officer approaching his fifth decade, carrying the accumulated discipline of a career built on administration as much as action. Yet the birth of the Luftwaffe, Germany's new and officially forbidden air arm, offered him something unexpected. It offered reinvention. He had spent years learning the bones of aerial warfare from the inside out, mastering organization, logistics, and the unglamorous machinery that keeps flying machines in the air. Now, suddenly, that knowledge was precisely what the new institution needed most. The Luftwaffe was proclaimed publicly in the spring of 1935, though its foundations had been laid years earlier in the shadows of the Versailles restrictions. Hermann Göring stood at its head, a First World War flying ace turned political operator, a man whose vanity was matched only by his appetite for power. Göring had the ear of Adolf Hitler and wore his authority like armor, but he was no administrator, and he knew it. The Luftwaffe needed men who could translate political ambition into functioning military architecture, who could build doctrine, train personnel, and establish the kind of institutional order that turns enthusiasm into capability. Kesselring, arriving from the army with a reputation for competent and unshowy professionalism, fit that need almost perfectly. He was appointed to senior administrative and command positions with a speed that surprised even some of his colleagues. For Göring, having a capable and pliable general with army credibility managing the difficult practical work of building an air force was an arrangement worth cultivating. What made Kesselring stand apart from many of his peers was his willingness to treat air power not as a supplement to ground operations, but as a domain with its own logic and its own demands. He studied the theory being developed by airmen and strategists across Europe, absorbed what was useful, and discarded what he found doctrinally excessive. He was not a man given to grand theoretical pronouncements. His innovation was practical rather than philosophical. He believed that an air force was only as effective as the organization beneath it, the maintenance schedules, the supply chains, the training pipelines, the communication systems that connected aircraft to the commanders, deciding where they flew and why. If those systems worked, the aircraft could be brilliant. If they failed, the most advanced machine in the sky was merely expensive wreckage waiting to happen. This conviction shaped everything he built during his years in the Luftwaffe's senior leadership. His relationships within the officer corps were complicated by the speed of his rise. There were men who had devoted their entire careers to aviation who found themselves subordinate to an army general who had learned to fly relatively late and who lacked the romantic attachment to the cockpit that many Luftwaffe officers wore as a badge of identity. Some resented it quietly. Others accepted it because Kesselring's competence was difficult to argue with. He was not the sort of commander who needed to be liked in the conventional sense. He was open in manner, often cheerful in disposition, and cultivated a reputation for accessibility that contrasted with the harder edges of some senior German officers. But underneath the affability was an insistence on results and a low tolerance for the kind of excuse-making that passes for explanation when organizations fail. People worked hard for Kesselring, partly because they respected him and partly because they understood that falling short would be noticed. His relationship with Göring deserves careful examination because it was never simple. Göring was politically powerful in a way that Kesselring was not and never sought to be. He controlled the Luftwaffe as a personal fiefdom, and the institutional culture he fostered rewarded loyalty to him personally as much as professional competence. Kesselring navigated this carefully. He understood that his position depended on remaining useful to Göring without becoming so powerful or so independent as to appear threatening. He was, in this sense, a political realist without being a political animal. He did not scheme for position or cultivate rivals. He delivered results, which is the most reliable form of protection in any environment where results are what the man at the top ultimately cares about. Göring, for his part, seems to have valued Kesselring's competence while maintaining the reflexive suspicion that powerful personalities in authoritarian systems develop toward anyone capable enough to be a rival. The 1930s were years of breathtaking institutional construction for the Luftwaffe. Training establishments multiplied, aircraft factories expanded, The theoretical frameworks for close air support, interdiction, and strategic bombing were debated, refined, and tested in exercises that grew more ambitious with each passing year. Kesselring was involved in much of this, shaping the practical doctrine that would govern how German air power was actually used when the moment came. He pushed for integration between air and ground forces, for communications systems that would allow commanders on the ground to call in air support, with something approaching real-time responsiveness. This was not a simple engineering problem. It was an organizational and cultural one, requiring the army and the Luftwaffe to trust each other enough to coordinate under pressure. Kesselring understood that building that trust was as important as building the aircraft themselves. He also worked within a political environment that demanded a particular kind of vigilance. The Nazi regime had penetrated every corner of German institutional life by the mid-1930s, and the military was no exception. Officers were expected to demonstrate political reliability alongside professional competence, and the line between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to the regime was deliberately blurred. Kesselring was not an ideological man in any deep sense. He was a conservative nationalist of the kind that Germany had produced in abundance, a man who believed in order, discipline, and the rightful place of a strong Germany in European affairs. He accommodated the regime without apparent internal conflict, which tells us something important about the moral atmosphere of the time and something complicated about the man himself. He was neither a resistor nor a fanatic. He was an officer doing his job within the system that employed him, which is perhaps the most difficult kind of person to judge. By the latter half of the decade, Kesselring held positions of genuine authority within the Luftwaffe command structure. He led one of the major air fleet commands, known as Luftflotten, which were the primary operational formations around which German air power was organized. This gave him direct responsibility for thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of personnel, and the logistical apparatus required to sustain them. The experience of commanding at this scale, with all the complexity it entailed, was invaluable preparation for what was coming. He learned how to manage competing demands, how to allocate scarce resources across multiple operational priorities, and how to maintain the morale of a large organization through the grinding uncertainties of preparation for a war that everyone in the room knew was approaching. The political dynamics within the Nazi military structure were simultaneously simpler and more treacherous than in a conventional military hierarchy. Simpler because ultimate authority was concentrated in Hitler and filtered downward through a small number of powerful figures like Goering. More treacherous because the rules of advancement and survival were inconsistent, personality dependent, and could shift without warning. Officers who read the room well survived and prospered. Those who misread it, who challenged too openly, who accumulated enemies in the wrong places, found themselves sidelined or worse. Kesselring's approach was to make himself indispensable at the operational level, while maintaining enough political neutrality to avoid being weaponized in the factional struggles that consumed so much energy in the upper reaches of the regime. It was a narrower path than it might appear, and he walked it with considerable skill. His reputation among military professionals extended beyond Germany during this period. The Luftwaffe was observed closely by foreign military attachés, and Kesselring was among those German officers whose names appeared in intelligence assessments from multiple countries. He was noted as capable, organized, and strategically serious. The British and French watched German air power expanding with a mixture of alarm and institutional denial, the human tendency to hope that what one sees is less threatening than it appears. For Kesselring, the knowledge that Germany was being watched added a dimension of professional pride to his work. He was building something that the world would have to take seriously, and he knew it. There was also, in these years, a genuine intellectual energy in the Luftwaffe that Kesselring found stimulating. The institution was young enough that ideas still mattered, that the right argument made by the right person at the right moment could actually change how things were done. He engaged with that energy without being swept away by it. He retained the skepticism of a man who had seen enough of military life to know that clever theory and effective practice are related but not identical, that the gap between them is filled by the kind of patient, unglamorous work that most theorists prefer not to think about. This made him, in the eyes of some colleagues, a brake on ambition. In the eyes of others, it made him the person you wanted in charge when the ideas finally had to become reality. By the time the 30s drew toward their violent close, Kesselring was one of the senior figures in an institution that was about to be tested in the most unforgiving way imaginable. He had risen far and fast, from a middle-ranking army administrator to a Luftwaffe commander with genuine authority over one of history's most formidable air forces. He had done it through competence and adaptability and a careful management of relationships in an environment where relationships were both essential and dangerous. What he had not yet done was fight a real war with the tools he had spent years building. That test was coming. The machinery of German aggression was nearly ready, and Albert Kesselring, at the helm of one of its most powerful components, was as prepared as preparation could make anyone for what was about to begin. In the final days of August 1939, the machinery of a new kind of war was already running. Across airfields in Silesia and Pomerania, ground crews worked through the night by torchlight, arming bombers and checking engines with the quiet urgency of men who understood what morning would bring. Albert Kesselring stood at the center of this operation, not as a distant figurehead, but as a commander who walked the flight lines, who asked questions and expected precise answers. He had spent years inside the bureaucratic architecture of the Luftwaffe, watching doctrine take shape on paper, arguing for resources, building schedules, and training regimes from nothing. Now, finally, the institution he had helped to construct was about to be tested against something real. For a man who had devoted the better part of a decade to preparation, the moment carried a particular kind of weight. He was not nervous, or at least he did not show it. He was focused, in the way that men become focused when they have run out of time to imagine alternatives. The 1st of September, 1939, arrived before dawn. German forces crossed the Polish frontier along a broad front, and within minutes the Luftwaffe was over Polish territory. Kesselring commanded Air Fleet 1, one of the principal air formations assigned to the campaign, responsible for supporting Army Group North as it drove toward Warsaw and the corridor separating Germany from East Prussia. His task was not simply to send aircraft into the air. It was to coordinate those aircraft with the movement of ground forces in real time, to suppress Polish air opposition before it could organize, to destroy communications nodes and railway junctions, and to make the advance of armored columns feel inevitable rather than contested. This was the theoretical promise of modern air power made operational, and it placed an enormous burden of coordination on the men at the top. Kesselring had thought through these problems in the abstract for years. Now he was living them, hour by hour, in a converted headquarters that hummed with signals traffic and the voices of liaison officers. The Polish Air Force was not the helpless victim that post-war mythology sometimes made it. Polish pilots were skilled and courageous, and their aircraft, though outclassed in most respects, were handled with real aggression in the opening days. German losses were not negligible. Kesselring absorbed the early reports with the composure of someone who had anticipated friction and refused to be destabilized by it. What mattered was the overall shape of the battle, the rate of attrition on both sides, the degree to which Polish airfields and command infrastructure were being degraded. His staff worked in shifts, processing reconnaissance data and adjusting target priorities with a speed that the campaign's pace demanded. The organization was imperfect. It always was in the opening days of any operation. But it held. And as the days accumulated, the weight of German air power began to tell in ways that numbers alone could not fully capture. One of the central challenges Kesselring faced was the problem of communication between air and ground. In theory, armored and motorized columns advancing rapidly through Polish territory were meant to have dedicated air liaison teams capable of directing close air support in something approaching real time. In practice, the system was new, the equipment was imperfect, and the pace of the advance sometimes outran the ability of air units to respond with precision. Kesselring pushed hard on this problem, not with anger, but with an insistence that bordered on relentlessness. He understood that the credibility of the entire concept of coordinated air-ground warfare depended on getting this interface right. Every failure was documented. Every lesson was fed back into the system. He was building institutional knowledge even as the campaign was still unfolding, which was characteristic of the way he approached command. Warsaw came under pressure from multiple directions as the campaign moved into its second week. The Polish government had not collapsed, Polish resistance had not evaporated, and the shape of the battle began to shift towards something more prolonged and operationally complex than the most optimistic German planning had assumed. Kesselring's air forces were tasked with a widening range of objectives: interdicting Polish supply routes, supporting encirclement operations, and applying pressure on the capital itself. The question of how to apply air power against a major city, against its infrastructure, its military installations, its psychological capacity to sustain resistance, was one that Kesselring grappled with during these weeks. He was not a man given to philosophical agonizing, but he was precise enough in his thinking to understand that indiscriminate destruction produced military problems of its own. Rubble-clogged roads, burning buildings generated smoke that obscured targets, and the collapse of civil order could complicate a military occupation before it had even properly begun. The campaign lasted just over 5 weeks. By early October, organized Polish resistance had been crushed, though partisan activity would persist for years. For the German military, the campaign was an extraordinary validation of doctrines that had been developed, argued over, and refined across the better part of a decade. For Kesselring personally, it was something more specific. He had commanded a major air formation in active operations for the first time, under conditions that tested not just tactical competence, but the deeper qualities of command. The ability to make decisions under uncertainty, to maintain cohesion inside a large organization operating at high tempo, and to adapt when the plan and the reality diverged. On all of these measures he had performed well, and the men around him knew it. What distinguished Kesselring in these weeks was not any single brilliant decision, but a quality of steadiness that his subordinates found genuinely reassuring. There were moments of real difficulty, communications failures, aircraft losses that landed harder than expected, coordination problems between his air units and the army formations they supported. Other commanders might have responded to these moments with fury or blame. Kesselring responded with analysis. He wanted to know exactly what had gone wrong and exactly what would be done differently. His demeanor on the flight line and in the operations room was calm to the point that younger officers sometimes mistook it for detachment. It was not detachment. It was the controlled concentration of a man who had decided that anxiety was a luxury he could not afford, and that the people around him needed to see someone who was thinking clearly. His relationship with the army commanders he worked alongside was also, by the standards of German inter-service relations, notably functional. The Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht had their tensions, institutional rivalries, doctrinal disagreements, and the ever-present competition for resources that characterized the Nazi military system. Kesselring was not immune to these pressures, but he was better than most of his peers at managing the human dimension of joint operations. He cultivated relationships with army commanders, listened to their requirements, and tried to deliver support in forms that were actually useful, rather than forms that looked impressive on a briefing map. This capacity for productive collaboration would define his reputation in the years ahead, and it began, in its recognizable form, in the fields and forests of Poland in the autumn of 1939. The broader lessons that Kesselring drew from the Polish campaign were both tactical and institutional. Tactically, he had confirmed that coordinated air-ground warfare could produce a rate of advance that overwhelmed an opponent's ability to respond coherently, but only if the coordination was genuine and not merely notional. The liaison systems needed to be faster, more robust, and better staffed. Reconnaissance assets needed to be prioritized differently at different stages of a campaign. The management of bomber formations over contested airspace required more flexibility than the pre-war doctrine had fully accommodated. He fed all of these observations into the Luftwaffe's planning apparatus, with a persistence that his colleagues sometimes found exhausting. Institutionally, he had demonstrated that an officer who had come to the Air Force without a background in aviation could nonetheless master its operational requirements, and that management ability, doctrinal clarity, and force of personality could substitute for the kind of instinctive aviator's understanding that career pilots possessed. Back in Berlin, the campaign's success generated a mood that Kesselring observed with a mixture of satisfaction and private caution. The easy confidence that settled over the upper levels of the Wehrmacht and the regime itself, the sense that the formula had been found, that the future belonged to speed and shock, was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. Kesselring had seen enough of war's friction, even in a campaign that had gone well by almost any measure, to understand that the next opponent would not be Poland. The French army, the British Expeditionary Force, the combined weight of Western Europe's remaining powers, these were different problems, with different answers. He did not say this loudly. He was not the kind of officer who accumulated enemies by publicly questioning the mood of collective triumph, but he thought it, and he planned accordingly. His growing confidence was real, but it was the confidence of a man who had tested himself and found the test instructive rather than merely satisfying. Poland had told him something important about what coordinated air-ground warfare could achieve at its best. It had also told him something important about the distance between doctrine and execution, between what the manuals described and what actually happened when aircraft and armor and infantry tried to act as a single system in the chaos of a living battlefield. The gap between those two things, the ideal and the actual, was where Kesselring would spend the rest of his career, in theaters far more demanding than the plains of Poland. He had no way of knowing that yet, but he was already developing the habits of mind that would allow him to survive the knowledge when it came. As October turned and the last embers of organized Polish resistance went cold, the German military began its turn toward the west. New plans were being drafted. New axes of advance were being argued over in headquarters across the Reich. Kesselring's air fleet would need to be reconstituted, resupplied, and retrained for an entirely different operational environment. The brief breathing space was consumed entirely by preparation, because that was the only way Kesselring knew how to use time that was not yet swallowed by crisis. He had learned to be a peacetime builder out of necessity, and he had learned to be a wartime commander out of the same necessity. The campaign in Poland had confirmed that the two qualities were not in tension. They were, in the right man, the same quality, expressed in different seasons. By the spring of 1940, Albert Kesselring had already proven himself a commander of uncommon adaptability. He had crossed from the old army into the new Air Force, mastered institutional politics, endured the chaos of Poland, and emerged from each test with his reputation not merely intact, but quietly enhanced. Now came a challenge of a different magnitude entirely. What the German High Command had spent months planning, and what the Western powers had spent months dreading, was about to begin. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, the heartland of Western Europe, lay across the German frontier, and the plan that would be used to crack it open was unlike anything the Allied commanders expected. Kesselring, commanding his air fleet from his headquarters deep within Germany's military apparatus, understood that the next few weeks would define not just the campaign, but the entire trajectory of the war. He had no illusions about the weight of what was coming. The offensive opened in the early hours of a morning in May of 1940, when German forces pushed across multiple frontiers simultaneously. Paratroopers descended from darkness onto Belgian fortresses. Armored columns rolled west through Luxembourg. And above all of it, the Luftwaffe swept forward in waves designed to suppress, to blind, and to destroy. Kesselring's air fleet bore responsibility for supporting Army Group B in the north, the force that would push through Belgium and the Netherlands in a great sweeping arc intended to draw Allied attention and Allied armies northward. It was a role of deliberate deception as much as brute force, and Kesselring understood the theatre well. The Allies, conditioned by the experience of the previous war, had built their defensive thinking around the assumption that the main blow would come where it had come before, through Belgium and along the traditional invasion corridors. Germany intended to exploit that assumption completely. What made the plan extraordinary, and what Kesselring's air operations were specifically designed to enable, was the simultaneous armoured thrust further south through the Ardennes forest. While Army Group B crashed into Belgium with maximum noise and maximum violence, Army Group A was threading armoured divisions through terrain that conventional military wisdom had long considered impassable at scale. Kesselring's air operations in the north were, in strategic terms, a kind of vast aerial distraction, ferocious enough to pin Allied reserves in place, dramatic enough to consume Allied attention, while the real decisive stroke gathered momentum to the south. The coordination required was extraordinary. Air operations had to be aggressive enough to be convincing, precise enough to avoid consuming resources needed elsewhere, and flexible enough to respond to the actual evolution of the battle as it unfolded hour by hour. In the first days, the Luftwaffe achieved something close to the air superiority Kesselring had always argued was the essential precondition of modern warfare. Dutch and Belgian airfields were hit in the opening strikes, their aircraft destroyed on the ground or driven from the sky in the opening engagements. The French Air Force, under-equipped, under-trained in the precise coordination that the Germans had been practicing for years, struggled to mount effective resistance across such a wide front. The Royal Air Force squadrons deployed to France fought with genuine courage and took a serious toll, but they were fighting at the end of long and vulnerable supply lines, on unfamiliar airstrips, against a numerically superior enemy operating with the advantage of interior lines. The balance of attrition was always going to favor the Luftwaffe, at least in these opening stages, and Kesselring pressed that advantage relentlessly. Ground commanders began to feel the difference almost immediately. German armored columns advanced with air cover overhead, with Stuka dive bombers available to break up concentrations of resistance that might otherwise have held key crossroads or river crossings for crucial hours. The psychological weight of those dive bombers, their sirens, their steep angles of attack, the impression of total enemy air dominance they projected, was as significant as the physical damage they inflicted. Troops who had been told to hold a position found themselves being bombed while their own aircraft seemed nowhere to be seen. Commanders who needed time to organize counterattacks found that time taken from them by attacks from above before they could even begin to execute. The cohesion of Allied defensive planning began to fray, not because any individual position was necessarily indefensible, but because the tempo of German operations, ground and air working together, left almost no space for the measured response that Allied doctrine depended upon. By the time the armoured columns of Army Group A emerged from the Ardennes and began crossing the River Meuse in force, the situation in the north had already consumed the best Allied reserves. British and French forces had moved north into Belgium to meet what they believed was the main German effort. Now they found themselves dangerously exposed, their left flank connected to nothing, their right flank increasingly uncertain, and the armoured breakthrough to their south, accelerating faster than anyone had imagined possible. Kesselring's air operations during this phase had performed their function precisely. The northern battle had absorbed Allied attention at the exact moment the southern stroke required that attention to be elsewhere. It was the kind of campaign that military planners dream about and rarely achieve, where everything, air, armor, infantry, deception, timing, aligned in something approaching coherent execution. The pace of advance that followed was bewildering to those experiencing it from the Allied side and extraordinary even to those directing it from the German side. Armoured columns raced west and then turned north, driving toward the English Channel coast with a speed that outran even the most optimistic projections. Kesselring shifted his priorities constantly, directing air support toward the cutting edges of the advance, providing cover for flanks that were extended to the point of theoretical vulnerability, and attempting to suppress Allied attempts to cut the narrow German corridor from the air or from the ground. The logistical demands were severe. Aircraft needed fuel, ammunition, maintenance, and replacement. Aircrew were flying multiple sorties in a single day. The infrastructure of a modern air campaign was being pushed to its operational limits, and Kesselring managed those limits the way he had always managed difficult situations, by staying close to the information, making decisions quickly, and trusting his subordinate commanders to execute without being micromanaged. The encirclement of Allied forces around Dunkirk in late May of 1940 presented what should have been the final act of a crushing German victory. Hundreds of thousands of British, French, and Belgian troops were compressed into a narrowing perimeter on the French coast, with the German army closing from the south and west, and the sea at their backs. Hermann Göring, always sensitive to Luftwaffe prestige and always willing to use his political access to the Führer to claim credit, argued loudly that the Air Force alone could finish the trapped Allied forces, rendering a costly ground assault unnecessary. Hitler, for reasons that historians have debated extensively, issued the order that halted the German army's advance. Kesselring found himself in the position of attempting to deliver, from the air, what ground forces should have been allowed to complete on the ground. The Dunkirk operation became a source of deep frustration for Kesselring. He had never argued that air power alone could achieve the kind of decisive destruction that Göring was promising. He understood, from years of thinking carefully about the relationship between air and land operations, that each element of warfare had its domain, and that claiming more for air power than it could realistically deliver was not strategic vision, but strategic vanity. The Luftwaffe flew intensively over the beaches, inflicting genuine damage and genuine casualties, but the evacuation proceeded across 9 days in late May and early June of 1940, under cloud cover that repeatedly grounded German aircraft through a defensive air umbrella provided by the Royal Air Force flying from England, and through the extraordinary improvised organization of hundreds of vessels large and small. More than 300,000 Allied soldiers were lifted from the beaches and returned to Britain. They would fight again, and Kesselring, reviewing what had happened, understood with some bitterness that a strategic opportunity had been narrowed by decisions made above his authority. France fell with a completeness and speed that stunned even those who had designed the campaign. The armistice was signed in late June of 1940, in the same railway carriage in which Germany had accepted defeat a generation before, a piece of theatre that the Nazi regime arranged with careful, deliberate symbolism. Kesselring had played a significant and genuine role in the victory. His air fleet had performed its assigned missions across the weeks of the campaign, adapting to changing circumstances, managing resources under severe operational pressure, and maintaining enough air superiority over key sectors to enable the ground operations that had produced the decisive breakthrough. He was promoted to General Field Marshal as part of the wave of senior elevations that followed the French campaign, joining a cohort of commanders who had delivered what had seemed to many observers, including many German ones, an almost improbable result. Yet Kesselring was not a man given to extended celebration. Even in the weeks following the armistice, as Germany absorbed the scale of what it had achieved, he was already turning his attention toward what came next. Britain had not surrendered. Britain, despite losing the bulk of its Continental Army's equipment at Dunkirk, had pulled its men home and shown no political inclination whatsoever toward the negotiated settlement that some in Germany believed the logic of the situation demanded. The English Channel, narrow as it was, remained an obstacle of a different kind than the Ardennes or the Meuse, and the Royal Air Force, which had fought creditably even in the unfavorable conditions of the French campaign, now sat on its home ground, under its own skies, with its own infrastructure behind it. Kesselring understood that the next phase would be fought on terms considerably less favorable than the ones that had just produced such astonishing results. The air battle over Britain was coming, and it would test him in ways that the French campaign, for all its demands, had not yet required. After the fall of France, the German High Command faced a problem it had not truly prepared for. Britain had not surrendered. The government in London had not collapsed, the army had not disintegrated, and the new Prime Minister had made it publicly, defiantly clear that there would be no negotiated peace. Across the English Channel, barely 32 kilometres at its narrowest, stood the last obstacle between Germany and total mastery of Western Europe. To cross that water, to mount an amphibious invasion, the German military needed one thing above all else: control of the skies. And so the mission fell, in large part, to the Luftwaffe. It fell, specifically, to commanders like Albert Kesselring, who now stood at the head of one of the most powerful air formations in the world, preparing to break a nation from the air. Kesselring commanded Luftwaffe 2, headquartered in Belgium and northeastern France. His air fleet was one of 3 Luftwaffen directed against Britain that summer, but his was arguably the most consequential. His aircraft would fly the shortest routes across the Channel, striking at southeastern England, at the industrial cities of the Midlands, and eventually at London itself. Looking back at the maps and the numbers available to him in those early weeks of summer 1940, Kesselring could have been forgiven a degree of confidence. The Luftwaffe had just dismantled the combined air forces of France, Belgium and the Netherlands in a matter of weeks. Fighter and bomber crews were battle-hardened. The command structure was responsive and experienced. Germany's enemies had been broken one after another. Why should Britain prove any different? The answer, though it would take months of grinding attrition to fully reveal itself, lay in a series of factors that no amount of confidence could overcome. The Royal Air Force was not the broken remnant that some German planners assumed. Fighter command had been carefully husbanded during the campaign in France, its commander deliberately withholding aircraft from a battle he judged to be already lost. The British radar network, the chain-home system running down the eastern and southern coasts, gave defending controllers advance warning of incoming raids that the Luftwaffe did not fully understand and never entirely neutralized. When German formations crossed the coast, squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires were already climbing to meet them, vectored into position by ground controllers, who knew where the enemy was before the enemy knew it was detected. For German air crews used to surprise and shock, this was a deeply unsettling experience. In the opening phase of the campaign, through July and into early August of 1940, Kesselring's forces focused on the Channel convoys and coastal targets. It was an attritional campaign, grinding and expensive, designed to draw British fighters into battle and destroy them in quantity. The logic was straightforward: eliminate Fighter Command's aircraft and experienced pilots faster than Britain could replace them, and air supremacy would follow. On paper, the arithmetic favoured Germany. In practice, it was far more complicated. British pilots who survived being shot down could be back in the cockpit within days. German pilots who bailed out over England went straight to prisoner of war camps. The Channel, which had always been Britain's greatest defence, was now eating Luftwaffe crews alive. The middle of August brought the campaign's most intense phase, when Kesselring directed major raids against the airfields of southeastern England. Day after day, formations of bombers escorted by fighters roared northward from their French bases. The targets were Fighter Command's sector airfields, the nerve centres of the British defensive system, radar masts, operations rooms, runways, fuel dumps. If these could be destroyed systematically, if the men who scrambled to intercept could be ground down beyond replacement, then the door would open. Kesselring pressed the campaign hard. The losses on both sides were severe. British Fighter Command was genuinely under strain, its pilots exhausted, its forward airfields repeatedly cratered, its reserves of experienced men running thin. There were moments in late August and early September when the pressure on Fighter Command was close to breaking point. Kesselring did not know quite how close, but he sensed that the campaign was working. Then came the decision that many historians regard as one of the most consequential errors of the entire war. The precise weight of responsibility has been argued over ever since, and Kesselring himself would later offer his own account of events. What is clear is that in early September of 1940, the strategic focus shifted. Instead of continuing the methodical destruction of Fighter Command's infrastructure, the Luftwaffe turned its weight against London. The city became the primary target. There were reasons offered at the time: retaliation for British raids on Berlin, the belief that attacking the capital would force Fighter Command into a decisive battle it could not avoid. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was to release the pressure on the very airfields and systems that had been closest to collapse. Fighter Command was given time to repair and recover. The breathing space proved invaluable. The 7th of September 1940 is the date when the great raids on London began in earnest. Wave after wave of bombers, escorted by fighters, struck the docks and industrial areas of the East End. The fires that night could be seen for enormous distances. The civilian population endured something that governments had feared since the earliest theories of strategic bombing had been written down: bombardment from the air on a scale and with an intensity that defied ordinary comprehension. Kesselring's aircraft were part of that, his bombers feeding into the stream that darkened the sky over the Thames estuary. Whatever his private calculations about airfields and radar stations, the campaign he was now running was one of direct pressure on a civilian population, a strategy that would harden British resolve rather than crack it. What the shift to London also meant, though it was not immediately obvious in the cockpits of the escorting fighters, was a critical change in the geometry of the battle. The German single-engine fighters, the Messerschmitt 109, the backbone of Luftwaffe fighter strength, had limited range. Flying from their bases in France to the new target areas over London and back consumed most of their available fuel. Time over the target area was desperately short. Pilots flying close escort to slow, heavily laden bombers could not fight effectively. They were tied to the formation, unable to use the aggressive, maneuvering tactics at which they excelled. The British fighters, by contrast, were fighting over their own territory, close to their own airfields, with all the freedom of movement that entailed. The operational constraint that distance imposed on German fighters was a structural problem that no amount of tactical skill could fully solve. September the 15th, 1940, has come to be remembered as the climactic day of the Battle of Britain. It was not the last day of fighting. The campaign continued well into the following year in various forms, but it was the day on which the German effort to break fighter command in preparation for invasion came decisively unstuck. Large formations directed at London were met by British squadrons in greater numbers than German intelligence had predicted. The losses inflicted on the Luftwaffe that day were significant, and the immediate result was that the planned invasion of Britain, the operation that the whole aerial campaign was supposed to enable, was postponed indefinitely. It was never revived. Within weeks, the Luftwaffe shifted to primarily night bombing, a campaign that could cause immense suffering and destruction, but could not achieve air superiority. The invasion that Kesselring's aircraft was supposed to make possible never came. Kesselring drew lessons from the battle that shaped his entire subsequent career, though not all of them were the lessons that a detached post-war analysis might suggest. He maintained, for many years afterward, that German air power had been within reach of a decisive result before the strategic focus shifted away from fighter command's airfields. Whether this assessment is entirely fair to the complexity of the situation, to the radar network, to British industrial production, to the mathematics of pilot replacement, is something historians have continued to examine carefully. What is certain is that the Battle of Britain was the first major setback the German military had suffered since the war began, and Kesselring had been at the center of it. He had commanded vast resources, brought considerable energy and organizational skill to the campaign, and still fallen short of the objective. For the man himself, there was no collapse of self-belief, no lasting crisis of confidence. That was not Kesselring's temperament. He had the particular resilience of commanders who find meaning in the act of command itself, who keep moving, keep planning, keep adapting, even when the situation turns against them. The questions that the Battle of Britain raised about the limits of air power, about the difficulty of destroying a determined enemy's air force over its own territory without the ability to sustain operations indefinitely, were questions that would resurface in every subsequent theatre he commanded. He had learned, perhaps more deeply than he acknowledged at the time, that a well-organized defense in depth could exhaust even the most powerful attacker. It was a lesson he would apply with formidable effect when the roles were eventually reversed, when it was his turn to be the defender, and his opponents would learn the same hard truth from the other side. The autumn and winter of 1940 and into 1941 saw the Luftwaffe continue its night campaign over Britain, but Kesselring's attention was already beginning to shift toward new theatres. The war was expanding in directions that would test commanders in ways the English Channel had only hinted at. To the east, plans were already being drafted that dwarfed anything attempted before. To the south, across the Mediterranean, another front was beginning to demand German attention. The Battle of Britain had ended without the result its architects intended, and Kesselring moved forward carrying its unresolved questions with him, into the vast, unforgiving spaces of the Soviet Union, and then, eventually, into the sun-baked terrain of the Mediterranean world. In the spring of 1941, the German military machine turned its attention eastward. The invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, would dwarf every previous campaign. It would be the largest military operation in human history, a collision of ideologies and industrial capacity that would reshape the entire Second World War. For Albert Kesselring, it represented a fundamental challenge unlike anything he had yet encountered. The air force he had helped build would be stretched across a front of more than 2,000 kilometers. The vast, unforgiving world of Russia would test not only his tactical acumen, but his ability to adapt to an entirely new scale of warfare. Kesselring received his assignment in late 1941. He was appointed commander of Luftwaffe 2, the Second Air Fleet, tasked with providing air support for the German advance into Soviet territory. Unlike the compact battlefields of France or the focused intensity of the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front would demand that his air forces cover impossibly vast distances. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Forward airfields had to be established in terrain barely conquered and hardly secured. From the moment the first bombers crossed the Soviet frontier, on the 22nd of June, Kesselring understood that this campaign would operate according to rules fundamentally different from those that had governed previous operations. The early weeks of Barbarossa appeared to confirm German superiority. The Luftwaffe achieved dramatic tactical successes. In the opening days of the invasion, German pilots claimed the destruction of more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft, many of them destroyed on the ground before they could even take flight. Kesselring coordinated close air support for advancing ground forces with a precision that mirrored the devastating effectiveness German air power had demonstrated in France. Bombers struck deep into Soviet territory, targeting airfields, supply depots, and rail yards. Fighters provided cover for the rapidly moving columns of tanks and mechanized infantry that penetrated further into Soviet territory with each passing day. For the first few months, Kesselring's command appeared to be operating in an environment of near-total air superiority. Yet beneath these apparent victories lay seeds of profound difficulty. The sheer scale of the Soviet Union confounded German planning in ways that earlier campaigns had not. Russian airfields seemed to multiply the moment German forces captured them. For every Soviet aircraft destroyed on the ground, the Red Air Force appeared to have countless more available from the seemingly inexhaustible Soviet reserves. Supply lines that had functioned adequately in France became nightmares of logistical impossibility in Russia. A German pilot flying from an airfield in occupied Poland required hours to reach his combat zone and hours more to return. Maintenance became increasingly difficult as mechanics struggled to keep fighter aircraft operational in the extreme cold that descended upon the Eastern Front as autumn arrived. What had seemed like a campaign of rapid conquest began, within months, to reveal itself as a test of endurance rather than a demonstration of tactical brilliance. Kesselring faced something that no amount of command experience could have fully prepared him for: the reality of Soviet industrial capacity. German military planners had consistently underestimated Soviet aircraft production. They had assumed that the destruction of Soviet aircraft in the opening months of the campaign would cripple the Red Air Force for years. Instead, factories deep within Soviet territory, relocated far beyond the reach of German bombing, continued to produce aircraft in startling numbers. By the autumn of 1941, Kesselring's air fleet was encountering Soviet fighter aircraft in greater numbers and with improved capabilities. The early assumption of air superiority began to erode. German losses mounted. Experienced pilots who had flown over France and Britain now found themselves facing an enemy that was learning, adapting, and growing stronger with each passing week. The adaptation required by Kesselring was not merely tactical but psychological. The Eastern Front demanded a different kind of warfare from what the Luftwaffe had previously practiced. The vast distances meant that aircraft were in the air for longer periods, consuming fuel that could never be fully replenished. The temperatures that fell to levels German mechanics had never encountered threatened the functionality of engines and hydraulic systems. Snow-covered airfields with such regularity that maintaining flight operations became an exercise in constant adaptation. Kesselring reorganized his command structures, established supply lines that pushed the limits of what was logistically possible, and worked to maintain morale among pilots and ground crews who faced conditions of increasing hardship. He recognized, with a clarity that not all German commanders possessed, that the Eastern Front was fundamentally different from previous campaigns, and that adapting to that difference would require relentless innovation. As 1942 arrived, the character of Kesselring's command shifted further. The German ground advance, which had seemed unstoppable in 1941, slowed and eventually stalled. Winter brought the first major offensive operation to a halt. When the campaign resumed, the momentum had shifted. Soviet counteroffensives began to push German forces backward in certain sectors. Kesselring's role evolved from that of a commander presiding over advancing air superiority to that of a commander managing the air dimension of a campaign that was becoming increasingly defensive. German losses in aircraft and trained pilots mounted at unsustainable rates. The pool of experienced fighter pilots was depleted by casualty rates that could not be compensated for by training new recruits quickly enough. The qualitative advantage that German pilots had enjoyed began to disappear as the quantity of Soviet pilots and the improving quality of Soviet aircraft shifted the balance. The scale of combat operations on the Eastern Front demanded logistical solutions that stretched German resources to breaking points. Kesselring oversaw not merely air operations but entire support structures. He coordinated the movement of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and personnel across vast distances under conditions of increasing Soviet air activity. The rear areas that supplied forward airfields became targets for Soviet bombers and fighters, intensifying the pressure on German logistics. Winter weather required that airfields be maintained with constant labor and resources. The loss of an airfield to Soviet advance meant the loss of considerable invested infrastructure and the disruption of supply operations. Kesselring had to balance the demands of immediate tactical support for ground forces against the necessity of protecting and maintaining the infrastructure that made air operations possible in the first place. By mid-1942, it became apparent that the early successes of Barbarossa had masked a fundamental strategic miscalculation. The campaign was not winning decisively. Instead, it was consuming resources, including irreplaceable trained pilots, valuable aircraft, and limited fuel reserves, at rates that the German economy could not sustain indefinitely. Kesselring found himself operating within an impossible strategic context. Hitler demanded offensive air operations to support ground forces. Yet German air resources were insufficient to maintain air superiority, while also providing close support for advancing troops and defending against increasing Soviet air activity. Kesselring had to make choices between conflicting demands that no amount of skill could fully resolve. He chose, increasingly, to concentrate available resources where they could have the greatest immediate impact, often at the expense of longer-term strategic considerations. The brutality of the Eastern Front was something that separated it fundamentally from other theaters where Kesselring had operated. The ideological character of the campaign, the Nazi regime's explicit commitment to conquest and destruction in the Soviet Union, infected every aspect of military operations. Kesselring, like other senior commanders, was aware of atrocities committed against Soviet civilians and captured soldiers. He operated within a system that treated the war in the East as fundamentally different from wars elsewhere. The scale of killing, the complete disregard for conventional laws of war, the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure and populations. These characterized the Eastern Front in ways that distinguished it from the campaigns in Western Europe. Kesselring's exact personal moral position regarding these phenomena remains historically complex. What is clear is that he commanded in an environment where the worst aspects of Nazi ideology were most visible and most actively implemented. The mounting losses and the evident failure of Barbarossa to achieve quick victory forced upon Kesselring a hard reckoning with reality. By the end of 1942, it was becoming evident that the campaign had failed in its fundamental objective of defeating the Soviet Union before the onset of another winter. The German military was now engaged in a two-front war, with the Western Allies beginning their own offensive operations against German-held territory. Kesselring continued to command on the Eastern Front, but the context within which he operated had fundamentally changed. The Luftwaffe was increasingly diverted to home defense as Allied bombing operations against German territory intensified. Resources flowed away from the Eastern Front toward other theaters. Kesselring had to manage the psychological and practical consequences of commanding air forces that were becoming progressively weaker relative to their enemies. As 1943 arrived, Kesselring's tenure on the Eastern Front was drawing toward its close. The strategic situation had evolved to a point where the question was no longer whether Germany would win on the Eastern Front, but how long German forces could maintain organized resistance. The Soviet Red Air Force, though still qualitatively inferior in some respects, was numerically dominant and growing stronger. German pilots who had dominated Soviet skies in 1941 were either dead, captured, or so depleted in training and resources that they could no longer maintain the standards they had once set. Kesselring received new orders. He would be transferred to the Mediterranean theater, where the Axis position in North Africa was crumbling, and an invasion of Sicily appeared imminent. His departure from the Eastern Front marked the end of his direct involvement in what had become, increasingly clearly, an unwinnable campaign. The experience of Barbarossa, the vast scale, the brutal adaptation required, the mounting losses against a relentless enemy, would inform every decision he made in the years that followed. The euphoria of the early Soviet campaign had evaporated like morning frost under a relentless sun. By the autumn of 1941, as Kesselring surveyed the sprawling Eastern Front from his command posts, the reality of what the German military had undertaken began to crystallize with terrible clarity. The invasion that was supposed to end in 6 months had already consumed more resources, more men, and more aircraft than the entire German war machine could sustain. Kesselring, commanding the Second Air Fleet across vast territories that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, found himself presiding over an air force locked in a desperate struggle against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. The Soviet Union had mobilized entire industries, relocated factories beyond the Urals, and poured out aircraft in numbers that defied the calculations of German planners. Where German strategists had predicted collapse, they instead discovered a nation that absorbed punishment and kept fighting. The winter of 1941 and 1942 arrived with savagery that German equipment and German soldiers, trained for a 6-month campaign, were wholly unprepared to endure. Kesselring's air operations throughout 1942 became a study in managing decline while maintaining the fiction of control. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies for nearly 3 years, now found itself increasingly outmatched by Soviet aircraft production that had recovered and accelerated beyond all estimates. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans of the Western campaigns and the Battle of Britain, still possessed superior individual skill and training, but individual skill could not overcome the mathematics of industrial production. Kesselring implemented rotating pilot rest systems, a practice almost unknown in the Soviet Air Force, which meant that German units operated at reduced strength, while Soviet replacements came constantly and in overwhelming numbers. The strategic problem was that Germany could not replace losses at anything approaching the rate at which they were being sustained. A German pilot shot down and killed represented years of training investment lost forever. A Soviet pilot shot down could be replaced within weeks by another trained aviator from the vast population that the Soviet state was willing to expend. This asymmetry in human resources, combined with growing Soviet technological improvements, created a strategic trap from which there was no escape except retreat or collapse. The supply situation, already precarious during the advance, became catastrophic as the Eastern Front stabilized into something resembling conventional warfare rather than the rapid mobile operations of 1941. Kesselring's air bases, scattered across hundreds of kilometers of captured Soviet territory, depended on supply lines stretching back through Poland and into Germany itself. Every aircraft, every bomb, every liter of fuel had to be transported across distances that grew daily as the front became fixed. The railways, the lifeblood of German logistics, were constantly threatened by Soviet partisans operating behind German lines and by the sheer difficulty of maintaining rail infrastructure across such vast territories during winter conditions that were utterly beyond anything the German transportation system had been designed to handle. Kesselring reported to Berlin with increasing urgency that his air fleet could not be sustained at current operational levels without accepting a fundamental reduction in overall capability. His requests for additional aircraft and fuel were met with vague assurances and political rhetoric about German industrial capacity, assurances that had no connection to the actual material reality that Kesselring could observe in his operational areas. By the spring of 1942, Kesselring's Second Air Fleet was operating at less than half the strength it had possessed during the opening weeks of Barbarossa. The quality of aircraft available to Kesselring's command deteriorated even as the demands upon them increased. The Messerschmitt 109, the fighter that had been the backbone of German air superiority for 3 years, was aging into obsolescence against increasingly capable Soviet aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190, introduced improvements but never arrived in sufficient numbers to replace losses. New designs were constantly being promised by the Air Ministry, elaborate schemes for revolutionary aircraft that would restore German aerial supremacy. These promises rang increasingly hollow to commanders in the field who watched their bomber streams suffer devastating losses to Soviet fighters, while transport aircraft needed to supply ground forces were diverted to bring fuel for fighters that could not be effectively deployed. Kesselring's diaries from this period reflect a man trapped between the impossible demands of the High Command and the brutal realities of his operational situation. He was expected to provide air support for ground operations, conduct bombing raids on Soviet industrial targets, defend against Soviet air attacks, and somehow accomplish all of this with declining resources and mounting losses. The mathematics of this problem admitted no solution. Every aircraft lost represented a reduction in overall capability that could not be compensated for by tactical brilliance or operational innovation. The Soviet counteroffensives of 1942, particularly around Stalingrad and in the Caucasus, demonstrated with stark clarity how the balance of power had shifted in the air. Kesselring's air units, attempting to support the German Sixth Army as it became encircled and slowly destroyed at Stalingrad, found themselves unable to provide the air cover and resupply that the ground forces desperately required. The Soviet Air Force, far from being destroyed in 1941, as some German planners had believed, had regrouped, retrained, and emerged as a genuinely formidable opponent. Soviet fighter tactics, initially crude by Western standards, had improved dramatically as Soviet pilots gained experience and as aircraft design reflected lessons learned from combat. Kesselring's pilots, many of them among the most experienced aviators in the world, could still achieve favorable kill ratios in individual engagements, but they were gradually being ground down through attrition. A German pilot who had achieved 50 kills might survive 500 more engagements before being killed or suffering an injury that removed him from combat. A Soviet pilot who had achieved 5 kills was doing exceptionally well and was likely to be killed within a handful of subsequent missions. Yet the Soviet Air Force, treating pilots as expendable resources, could sustain and even increase its operational strength, while the Luftwaffe, with its more conservative approach to personnel losses, was inexorably shrinking. Kesselring's command during 1943 took on an increasingly defensive character as Soviet military capability continued to grow and German resources continued to shrink. The strategic situation across the entire Eastern Front had transformed from a German offensive operation to a German defensive struggle, simply to hold territory that the Soviets were determined to recapture. Kesselring, who had built his reputation on offensive air operations during the Polish and French campaigns, now found himself presiding over a defensive air campaign that was fundamentally unwinnable in strategic terms. He could win individual battles in the air, maintain local air superiority in selected sectors for brief periods, and inflict heavy losses on Soviet air units. But none of these tactical or operational successes could reverse the underlying strategic reality that Soviet industrial production was outpacing German industrial production, and Soviet manpower reserves vastly exceeded whatever the German military could muster. The summer offensive at Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in human history, represented a last German attempt to seize strategic initiative and reverse the momentum of the war on the Eastern Front. Kesselring's air fleet was expected to provide decisive air support for this operation. Instead, despite significant German air efforts, Soviet air forces mounted increasingly effective opposition, and the offensive ground to a halt without achieving its objectives. The attrition of German aircrew reached levels that became difficult to conceal even within the hierarchical structure of the Nazi military. Replacement pilots arriving from training units were often lightly experienced, sometimes with only a handful of hours of combat flying, before being thrown into units facing Soviet air superiority. The system of rotating experienced pilots out of combat to serve as trainers, which might have been sustainable in a war lasting 2 or 3 years, became increasingly untenable as the war's duration extended and losses mounted. Kesselring found himself in the position of having to cannibalize experienced units to create new formations that were nominally at full strength but practically at only a fraction of their theoretical capability. The psychological impact of this degradation should not be underestimated. German pilots, many of them volunteers, or volunteers who had emerged from the national conscription system, had joined the Luftwaffe with pride in their membership in what they believed was the finest air force in Europe. By 1943, that institution was manifestly failing, and the blame for that failure, from the perspective of field commanders, lay not with any deficiency of the pilots themselves, but with the strategic catastrophe of having opened a two-front war that the German economy could not sustain. Kesselring's relationships with his immediate superiors in the Luftwaffe High Command became strained as the reality of the Eastern Front situation became inescapable. Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal and Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe, had staked his personal prestige on promises of German air superiority that were rapidly becoming impossible to fulfill. Kesselring's reports, which were necessarily honest about losses, capabilities, and the deteriorating situation, were sometimes received with anger or skepticism. There was a deep tension between those in the high command who wanted to preserve the fiction of German air dominance and those field commanders who saw daily evidence of German air decline. Kesselring, who had built his career on professional competence and who took pride in accurate assessment of military situations, found himself in the uncomfortable position of delivering bad news to superiors who did not want to hear it. He was not a sycophant of the regime in the manner of some Nazi military figures, but he was a professional officer who understood the importance of maintaining coherent military command structures. This tension between professional honesty and political pressure, which would characterize his entire experience on the Eastern Front, contributed to the mounting stress that marked this period of his life. The gradual transfer of Kesselring's attention and resources away from the Eastern Front and toward the Mediterranean theatre, which accelerated through late 1942 and 1943, was both a reflection of his value to the German military and an indication of how the situation in the East was being assessed by the High Command. Kesselring retained the nominal title of Commander of Air Operations on the Eastern Front, while being given increasingly significant responsibilities in the Mediterranean. This arrangement reflected the reality that no single commander, however competent, could reverse the fundamental imbalance in resources that had developed between Germany and the Soviet Union. The decision to deploy Kesselring to new theatres also reflected the fact that he had proven himself capable of managing complex operations across vast distances and of maintaining operational coherence despite severe resource constraints. These were precisely the skills that would be needed as the Axis faced mounting crises on multiple fronts. Yet his departure from the Eastern Front was also, in a very real sense, an admission that the German military had no solution to the problem that the Soviet Union presented. The best that German military leadership could hope for was to hold certain strategic positions while managing decline across the rest of the continent. The final year of German air operations on the Eastern Front, from mid-1943 onward, became almost solely the province of defensive operations aimed at preserving whatever air capability Germany still possessed, while gradually yielding territory to Soviet ground offensives. Kesselring's successors in command, though competent professionals, inherited a situation that had deteriorated so completely that no amount of tactical brilliance could reverse the outcome. Soviet air forces had achieved overwhelming numerical superiority, and the qualitative gap that had once favored German pilots was closing as Soviet pilot training improved and Soviet aircraft design benefited from captured German aircraft and from study of German air combat tactics. The Eastern Front, which had promised to be the theatre where German military superiority would be most decisively demonstrated, had instead become the graveyard of German air power. Kesselring, who had commanded German air operations at the moment when that air force was at its height of power and prestige, would carry the memory of that decline for the rest of his life. He had witnessed the transition from German air superiority to German air inferiority, and he understood, as perhaps few other commanders did, the precise moment and the specific causes of that transformation. The legacy of Kesselring's command on the Eastern Front was complex and ambiguous, neither fully successful nor entirely responsible for the catastrophe that unfolded. He had taken command of an air force that was fundamentally inadequate to the strategic challenges posed by a war against the Soviet Union, and he had managed that inadequacy with professionalism and competence. Yet managing decline, however skillfully, was not the same as reversing decline or achieving strategic objectives. Kesselring's years on the Eastern Front coincided with the period in which the German military shifted from being the offensively dominant force in Europe to being a defensive force fighting for survival. This transformation was not primarily the result of any failure on Kesselring's part, but rather the inevitable consequence of having engaged the Soviet Union in a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Kesselring's value to the Nazi regime, paradoxically, increased as the military situation deteriorated, because his ability to manage complex operations in adverse circumstances became more valuable precisely as the number of adverse circumstances multiplied. The Eastern Front had taught him lessons about the limits of air power, about the importance of logistical sustainability, and about the dangers of fighting a war that stretched beyond a nation's economic capacity. These lessons would shape his approach to the challenges he would face in the Mediterranean and in Italy in the years to come. In the spring of 1941, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring received orders that would reshape the trajectory of his war. The German High Command, watching with growing anxiety as their Italian allies faced mounting pressure in North Africa, made a critical decision. They would dispatch Kesselring to take command of German forces in the Mediterranean theatre, tasked with salvaging what remained of Axis ambitions in that vast and hostile region. It was a promotion of sorts, a recognition of his capabilities, yet it carried with it an almost impossible mandate. He would not simply command German troops. He would be forced to work alongside Italian forces, coordinate across thousands of kilometers of sea and desert, and restore German prestige to a theatre where Italian failures had become almost routine. The appointment arrived at a moment when the initiative was slipping from Axis hands, when British forces under General Archibald Wavell had already driven Italian armies from Cyrenaica and were threatening to unravel the entire North African position. Kesselring accepted the assignment with the clarity of a man who understood both the gravity of the situation and the limitations of what could realistically be achieved. When Kesselring arrived in North Africa in the spring of 1941, he confronted a landscape transformed by recent campaigns. The deserts of Libya stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, a terrain that defied conventional logistics and demanded a complete reimagining of how armies could operate. What he found was a military situation approaching collapse. Italian forces, brave but poorly equipped and inadequately trained, had suffered a catastrophic series of defeats at the hands of British forces that, despite their own numerical disadvantages, had proven far more mobile and aggressive. German units already present in North Africa were limited in number, stretched thin across vast distances, and struggling to maintain supply lines that depended entirely on vulnerable sea routes. The infrastructure for modern warfare barely existed. Airfields were primitive, ports were damaged or congested, and the basic requirements for sustaining large military operations were almost entirely absent. Yet within this chaos, Kesselring saw opportunity. He recognized that the theater, for all its hardships, remained strategically vital. Control of North Africa meant control of the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean was the key to keeping open the routes to the Middle East, to India, and to the sources of oil that Germany desperately needed. His immediate task was to arrest the deteriorating situation before it spiraled beyond recovery. It was in this context that Kesselring encountered Erwin Rommel, a commander whose reputation had already begun to spread far beyond the confines of military circles. Rommel had arrived in North Africa only weeks before Kesselring, commanding the Afrika Korps, a force of German mechanized troops sent specifically to stiffen Italian resistance and prevent a complete collapse. The relationship between these two commanders became one of the most significant partnerships in German military history, though it was not without its complications and tensions. Kesselring was the senior officer, the commander-in-chief of the entire theatre, yet Rommel wielded enormous influence through his aggressive tactics and his growing reputation as a warrior of exceptional ability. Rommel's approach to warfare was fundamentally different from Kesselring's own. Where Kesselring thought in terms of logistics, supply, and the careful management of limited resources, Rommel believed in the offensive spirit, in aggressive maneuver, and in the conviction that bold action could overcome material disadvantages. Kesselring, by contrast, had learned through his experiences in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union that logistics determined campaigns as much as combat did. These differing philosophies would shape the conduct of operations in North Africa throughout the years that followed. Kesselring's first strategic challenge was to stabilize the front before attempting any offensive action. He recognized that Italian morale had been shattered by successive defeats, and that German forces, while more capable, remained numerically insufficient to fight an offensive war across the vast distances of North Africa. His approach was methodical and patient, characteristics that aligned poorly with the expectations of Hitler and the German High Command, who desired swift victories and rapid transformations of the strategic situation. Kesselring began by reorganizing the command structure, creating a unified system of coordination between German and Italian forces that, while imperfect, at least provided some coherence to operations. He worked to improve supply lines, recognizing that every ton of equipment and food that reached North Africa across the Mediterranean was a precious resource that needed to be carefully husbanded. He also began to understand the Italian military's limitations and strengths, working to find roles for Italian units that matched their capabilities while reserving more demanding tasks for German troops. This pragmatic approach frustrated Rommel, who chafed at what he perceived as excessive caution, yet Kesselring's methods gradually achieved their intended effect. The front stabilized, Italian forces began to recover some measure of confidence, and the Axis position in North Africa, while precarious, no longer appeared to be on the brink of imminent collapse. By late 1941, Kesselring and Rommel launched a coordinated offensive that achieved initial success and demonstrated the potential of their partnership despite their differences. The offensive drove eastward across Cyrenaica, recapturing territory that had been lost and restoring Axis prestige at a moment when such victories were desperately needed. British forces, caught off guard by the sudden German offensive, retreated before superior German tactical coordination. The campaign showcased Rommel's genius for rapid maneuver and exploitation of enemy mistakes, while demonstrating Kesselring's capacity to support and sustain offensive operations across vast distances. Supply lines were stretched to their limits. Lines of communication extended hundreds of kilometers across empty desert. Yet the carefully planned logistical apparatus that Kesselring had established held firm. The offensive reached its culmination when German and Italian forces besieged Tobruk, a British-held fortress on the Libyan coast that had become the symbol of British resistance in North Africa. Yet Kesselring's supply situation was becoming critical. Every additional kilometer of advance extended his lines of communication further across hostile territory, and the limitations of what German industry and Italian resources could provide became increasingly apparent. The British, despite their defeats, could draw upon supplies from their empire and from the United States, resources that the Axis could never match. The relationship between Kesselring and Rommel, which had begun as a partnership of mutual respect, gradually became strained as the campaign progressed. Rommel continually pressed for deeper offensives, for bolder maneuvers, and for an aggressive posture that Kesselring increasingly recognized as strategically unsustainable. Rommel believed that the key to victory in North Africa lay in striking hard and fast before the British could recover, in achieving a breakthrough that would shatter their position and open the way to Cairo and the Suez Canal. Kesselring understood the appeal of this vision, but he also grasped the brutal mathematics of supply that governed warfare in the desert. Every offensive that penetrated deeper into enemy territory pushed his lines of communication further from the ports and airfields that supplied them, while simultaneously bringing them closer to British reserves and reinforcements. Rommel's approach, for all its tactical brilliance, was fundamentally at odds with the material realities of the theatre. Letters and reports between the two commanders reflect growing frustration on both sides. Rommel felt that Kesselring was overly cautious, insufficiently committed to the aggressive prosecution of the campaign. Kesselring, by contrast, became increasingly convinced that Rommel's operational methods, however tactically sound, were strategically reckless and ultimately unsustainable. These tensions were never resolved, and they would continue to shape German operations in North Africa throughout 1942 and beyond. Kesselring's command in the Mediterranean theatre also forced him to confront the practical limitations of Italian military capability and the diplomatic complications that arose from commanding forces from multiple nations. The Italian military, unlike its German counterpart, labored under chronic shortages of equipment, training, and leadership. Italian aircraft were obsolete compared to British fighters. Italian tanks were inferior to both German and British vehicles, and Italian infantry, while sometimes brave, lacked the training and cohesion of German units. Yet Kesselring could not simply dismiss or marginalize the Italian forces. They constituted the majority of his manpower, and ignoring them would have been politically impossible. Instead, he worked to develop operational methods that compensated for Italian limitations. Italian units were often deployed in holding roles along defensive lines, where they could maintain positions without requiring the constant aggressive action that stretched their capabilities. German units, smaller in number but higher in capability, were concentrated at critical points where decisive action might be achieved. This division of labor was never entirely satisfactory to anyone involved, but it represented a pragmatic solution to an impossible problem. Kesselring's willingness to work with Italian forces, to treat them as something other than mere liability, earned him respect from Italian commanders, even as it frustrated some of his German subordinates who felt their talents were being squandered in support of inferior allies. The challenge of coordinating air operations across the Mediterranean theatre presented another dimension of Kesselring's responsibilities that showcased his background in the Luftwaffe. German air superiority in the theatre was never assured. In fact, as time progressed, German air strength actually declined, while British air capability steadily increased. Kesselring worked to establish air bases across North Africa and Italy, to coordinate fighter protection for ground forces, and to balance the demands of air defense against the requirements of supporting offensive operations. The distance and isolation of the theatre meant that Luftwaffe units operating there were often cut off from the rapid reinforcements and resupply that units elsewhere in Europe could expect. When aircraft were damaged, replacement parts were often weeks or months in coming. When pilots were shot down, they were frequently lost entirely, as sea routes prevented most recovery operations. These realities imposed a kind of discipline on air operations that Kesselring understood intimately, having commanded air forces on other theatres. He recognized that air forces in North Africa had to be used with meticulous care, every sortie calculated to produce a return proportionate to the resource expended. This methodical approach to air warfare sometimes conflicted with the more aggressive demands of ground commanders who desired unlimited air support for their operations. By 1942, the strategic situation in North Africa was beginning to shift in ways that no amount of German tactical skill could fully compensate for. American forces, following their entry into the war, had begun to arrive in the theatre in increasing numbers. British forces were receiving new equipment, new aircraft, and new tanks at a rate that exceeded German and Italian capacity to replace losses. Rommel's offensive attempts continued, most notably the assault on the Gazala line and the drive toward Egypt in the summer of 1942. But each offensive moved farther from the base areas and stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Kesselring supported these offensives, understanding Rommel's vision and recognizing the stakes involved, yet his warnings about supply shortages became increasingly urgent and increasingly ignored by the high command in Berlin. Hitler and the military leadership, desperate for victories after the failure to defeat the Soviet Union, were unwilling to accept the limitations that Kesselring articulated. They demanded that Axis forces in North Africa continue to advance, to seek decisive victory, to defeat the British and seize Egypt and the Suez Canal. These demands were not merely unrealistic, they were impossible, given the material resources available and the inherent limitations of operating across such vast distances with supply lines dependent on vulnerable sea routes. Kesselring's position in the Mediterranean theatre by 1942 had become increasingly complex and contradictory. He was subordinate to the German High Command, yet held supreme responsibility for operations in the theatre. He was superior to Rommel in rank, yet increasingly deferential to Rommel's tactical judgments and aggressive instincts. He was responsible for coordinating Italian forces that lacked the capability to execute the tasks assigned to them. He commanded air forces that, while capable, were outnumbered and increasingly outgunned by British air superiority. He was expected to maintain and extend the Axis position in North Africa, despite a supply situation that grew more precarious with each passing month. The strain of these contradictions began to take its toll on Kesselring, both professionally and personally. His correspondence from this period reflects frustration with the demands placed upon him and doubt about whether the objectives he was being ordered to achieve were even remotely achievable. Yet he persisted in his efforts, continuing to seek solutions to problems that appeared increasingly insoluble, continuing to work with Rommel despite their differing visions, continuing to extract whatever performance he could from Italian forces despite their manifest limitations. This period of command in the Mediterranean, for all its challenges and frustrations, was also a period of genuine learning for Kesselring, a time when he deepened his understanding of coalition warfare, of logistics in distant theaters, and of the relationship between military capability and political necessity. As 1942 progressed into 1943, the question of whether Axis forces could maintain their position in North Africa ceased to be a matter of strategic debate and became instead a matter of grim inevitability. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery had defeated Rommel's army at the Battle of El Alamein in the autumn of 1942, a defeat that marked the beginning of the end for Axis hopes in North Africa. American forces under General Dwight Eisenhower had landed in Morocco and Algeria, opening a second front from which British and American forces could advance eastward. Kesselring found himself caught between two advancing armies, forced to conduct a fighting withdrawal across hundreds of kilometers of desert toward Tunisia. The retreat that followed would test his skills as a commander in ways that victory never could. It would demand precise orchestration of complex movements, careful preservation of military order despite the pressure of pursuing enemies, and the maintenance of morale and cohesion in forces that were increasingly aware that their position was becoming untenable. The partnership between Kesselring and Rommel would be tested further as they worked to extricate their forces from North Africa. The Mediterranean theatre, which had begun in 1941 as a region of potential German expansion and strategic opportunity, was becoming instead a region of desperate defense and ultimate retreat. Yet in 1941, when Kesselring had first arrived in North Africa, the future had appeared open and uncertain. The appointment to command in the Mediterranean theatre had represented an opportunity for a commander of exceptional ability to shape the course of the war in a critical region. Kesselring's early months in the theatre had demonstrated remarkable success in stabilizing a collapsing situation, in establishing a working relationship with Rommel despite their differences, and in creating the organizational and logistical foundations for sustained Axis operations. His work with Italian forces showed a sophistication in coalition command that would serve him well in later campaigns. His efforts to balance Italian capabilities with German requirements displayed a pragmatic understanding of how to extract maximum value from limited and unequal resources. The Mediterranean theatre in 1941 was not yet the graveyard it would become, and Kesselring's command there, while ultimately unable to achieve the grand strategic objectives that Berlin demanded, represented. By the middle of 1942, the strategic world of North Africa had begun to shift beneath Kesselring's feet. The initial momentum of the Axis advance, so promising in the desert campaigns of the previous year, had stalled against a combination of British resistance, American intervention, and the mounting complexities of sustaining operations across thousands of kilometers of hostile terrain. Kesselring found himself commanding not merely a military force, but an increasingly desperate enterprise, one in which supply lines stretched thinner by the week, and the arrival of fresh Allied reinforcements tilted every calculation toward catastrophe. The commander who had orchestrated air operations across Europe now faced a different kind of adversary, not the RAF over Britain, but rather the combined industrial capacity of the British Empire and the United States, applied with methodical determination in an arena where Germany's advantages had already begun to erode. His task was no longer to achieve breakthrough, but to delay, to preserve what remained of Axis strength in Africa, while the wider strategic situation deteriorated across multiple theaters. This chapter in his military career would test not his capacity for offensive brilliance, but his ability to manage retreat with discipline and coherence, to extract fighting forces from an increasingly untenable position while maintaining the semblance of organized military command. The turning point had come at El Alamein in late 1942, where British forces under Bernard Montgomery had halted the Axis advance and then, with careful deliberation, begun their own counter-offensive. Kesselring had not been present at that battle directly, but its consequences fell upon him immediately and completely. The desert, which had promised unlimited possibility for maneuver and surprise in the earlier campaigns, now became a trap, open enough that superior Allied forces could outflank any defensive position, yet constrained enough that retreat required careful coordination to avoid catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe's capacity to support ground operations had already begun its decline, as aircraft were needed elsewhere and the demands on fuel and maintenance became impossible to meet. Italian forces, which had been present alongside German units throughout the North African campaign, now began to show the strain of prolonged warfare far from home, their equipment increasingly antiquated and their morale slowly corroding. Kesselring inherited this deteriorating situation and made a decision that would define the next several months of his command. He would fight a methodical withdrawal, trading space for time, exacting a price from the Allies at each prepared position, while gradually reducing the threat to Axis forces and preparing for the eventual evacuation. It was not a strategy born of optimism, but of ruthless calculation about what was possible and what was not. The retreat began almost immediately after the failure to break through at El Alamein. What had been a rapid advance across hundreds of kilometers became a slow, contested withdrawal measured in dozens of kilometers per week. Kesselring established successive defensive lines, each one prepared in advance when possible, each one designed to delay the British advance long enough to allow further consolidation of positions deeper to the west. The tactical challenge was immense. Too strong a defense at any given position would exhaust resources and men needed for subsequent withdrawals, but too weak a defense would invite rapid pursuit and the encirclement of Axis forces before they could disengage. He coordinated with Italian commanders, though the relationship was complicated by diverging interests and the reality that Italian forces were deteriorating faster than German units. The Luftwaffe presence in North Africa, once formidable, had dwindled to a fraction of its former strength, as aircraft were systematically withdrawn to meet crises in other theaters. Anti-tank guns and artillery became the primary tools of delay, carefully positioned on high ground to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces, while the main body of troops withdrew to prepared secondary positions. Every day of delay was counted as a victory in this grim calculus of tactical withdrawal. The supply situation, always precarious in the desert, had become genuinely catastrophic by 1942. The Mediterranean Sea, which provided the most direct route for reinforcement and supply, had become increasingly dominated by Allied naval and air forces. German and Italian ships faced constant attacks from British aircraft and submarines, with tonnage sunk mounting steadily and the percentage of supplies that actually reached North Africa declining from month to month. Supply lines that stretched across the sea and then overland to forward positions were vulnerable at every point, and the loss of ships meant not merely the loss of supplies, but the loss of vessels themselves, which could not be easily replaced. Kesselring found himself in the position of managing scarcity at every level, deciding which units would receive fuel and ammunition, watching helplessly as plans had to be scaled back due to insufficient resources, making decisions about where to concentrate strength and where to accept weakness. The contrast between the vast distances of the North African theatre and the shrinking capacity to sustain operations across those distances created constant tension. He was commanding forces that were nominally substantial, but practically weakened by chronic shortages, a situation that demanded tactical brilliance simply to avoid total collapse. The arrival of American forces in North Africa in November 1942 added another dimension to the crisis. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, had caught German planning by surprise and forced a rapid reassessment. Suddenly, Kesselring faced not only the British forces pressing from the east, but the Americans advancing from the west, threatening to encircle the entire Axis position in North Africa. The coordination between American and British forces was not seamless at this stage. Command arrangements were still being worked out, and the Americans lacked the experience of their British counterparts, but their combined strength was overwhelming. Kesselring adjusted his strategy accordingly, recognizing that the window for organized withdrawal was closing and that the Axis presence in North Africa was now on borrowed time. He began shifting focus toward minimizing losses and preparing for the possibility of evacuation, ensuring that German units could be extracted to continue fighting elsewhere. The idea of holding North Africa indefinitely had to be abandoned. The only remaining question was how much of the Axis force could be preserved and shipped back to Europe. Through 1943, the retreat continued with grim regularity. Kesselring conducted a fighting withdrawal that drew praise even from Allied commanders, who recognized that he was extracting maximum benefit from limited resources and difficult terrain. Each defensive position lasted days or weeks, inflicting casualties on the attackers before being abandoned to avoid encirclement. The relationship between Kesselring and Erwin Rommel, once close during the earlier phases of the North African campaign, had become strained by disagreement over strategy. Rommel believed that the situation in North Africa was irretrievable and argued for rapid evacuation, while Kesselring maintained that every day of continued resistance in Africa delayed the Allies from attacking other objectives. The political complications of this disagreement, Rommel's higher standing with Hitler, Kesselring's seniority in command, created additional friction. Eventually, Rommel would be withdrawn from North Africa, leaving Kesselring as the senior German commander for the final phase of the campaign. By the spring of 1943, the end was approaching with accelerating speed. The Allies were closing in from multiple directions, and the Axis forces in North Africa were being squeezed into an increasingly confined area in Tunisia. Kesselring faced a final, critical decision: to attempt a last-ditch defense of the remaining territory, or to accept the inevitable and focus entirely on extraction. He chose the latter path, ordering the concentration of resources on evacuating German forces across the Mediterranean to Sicily and Italy, while accepting the loss of Italian forces and equipment that could not be transported. The decision was ruthless and strategic, prioritizing the preservation of German military capability for future defensive operations. Italian forces, lacking adequate transport and evacuation capacity, were largely left to their fate, a choice that reflected both the reality of transport limitations and the German assessment of where resources should be concentrated. The evacuation itself became a race against time, with German naval and air units struggling to maintain supply lines and transport capacity, while the Allies pressed closer. The final weeks in North Africa saw the Axis position collapse into fragments. German units that had fought across thousands of kilometers of desert for nearly 2 years now found themselves compressed into a shrinking perimeter around the Tunisian ports. The Luftwaffe's presence had dwindled to almost nothing, unable to provide the air cover that might have slowed the Allied advance. Supply shipments across the Mediterranean became sporadic and increasingly inadequate. Kesselring, coordinating from his headquarters, struggled to maintain coherence as the situation deteriorated around him. Decisions about which units would be evacuated and in what order became agonizing calculations, with every choice meaning that some soldiers would be left behind to surrender or die. The morale of the remaining troops deteriorated as it became clear that the evacuation could not include everyone, that choices were being made about who would escape and who would be captured. By early May 1943, the evacuation was essentially complete for German forces, though substantial Italian forces remained behind. Kesselring himself departed North Africa, leaving behind a military situation that was beyond recovery. The final pockets of organized Axis resistance in Tunisia collapsed within weeks, with thousands of German and Italian troops surrendering to overwhelming Allied forces. The campaign that had once promised strategic advantage through control of North Africa and potentially the Suez Canal had ended in complete evacuation and loss. What had been achieved, however, was the preservation of the core of the German forces that had fought in North Africa, units that would now be transferred to Sicily and Italy to continue resistance elsewhere. The cost had been enormous. Years of fighting, thousands of casualties, the loss of most Italian forces, and the complete abandonment of North Africa to Allied control. Kesselring's reputation, however, survived the evacuation intact. Allied commanders who had fought against him in North Africa recognized that he had managed to retreat with discipline and tactical skill, that he had extracted what could be extracted without allowing complete catastrophe to overtake his forces. The fighting withdrawal across North Africa, though ultimately unsuccessful in strategic terms, had demonstrated Kesselring's capacity to manage operations under pressure, to make difficult decisions, and to maintain military order in circumstances of mounting adversity. British and American commanders noted his competence with a respect that transcended the normal hostility of warfare. Montgomery, in particular, would later acknowledge Kesselring's abilities as a field commander, even as they remained opponents. The evacuation had bought time as well, time that would now be invested in the defense of Sicily and Italy, where Kesselring would continue to resist Allied advances with the same methodical, disciplined approach that had characterized his North African operations. The loss of North Africa represented a strategic turning point for Germany and the Axis powers. The initiative in the Mediterranean would now pass entirely to the Allies, who would use their control of North Africa as a springboard for the invasion of Sicily and the Italian Peninsula. For Kesselring personally, the evacuation marked a transition from commander of geographically dispersed operations to commander focused on a single, increasingly vital theatre. The lessons learned in North Africa, the importance of supply lines, the challenges of fighting with numerically superior enemies, the tactical possibilities of terrain and prepared positions, would shape his approach to the Italian campaign that was now beginning. He left Africa having preserved German military capability against enormous odds, having demonstrated his competence under pressure, and having learned that the only real victory in such circumstances lay in the orderly extraction of forces to continue fighting elsewhere. The retreat across North Africa had been a defeat, but it had been a defeat managed with skill and discipline, characteristics that would define Kesselring's command in the theatres that lay ahead. The summer of 1943 brought a turning point neither Kesselring nor the German High Command had fully anticipated. North Africa had fallen. The great prize of the Mediterranean lay exposed, and across the narrow straits from Sicily, American and British fleets were assembling with a purpose that would shape the final 2 years of the European war. In the corridors of German command, a decision crystallized. Someone would have to stand in Italy and hold the line. That someone was Albert Kesselring. By July, he had received his orders. He was to assume command of all German forces in Italy, inheriting a catastrophe in slow motion, and tasked with preventing the Allies from simply marching up the peninsula toward the Reich itself. Few men in the Wehrmacht possessed the combination of Air Force training, Mediterranean experience, and diplomatic flexibility that the job demanded. Fewer still could survive what was about to unfold. Kesselring arrived in Italy in early summer to find a nation already fracturing at its seams. Mussolini's regime, once Germany's proud partner, was collapsing under the weight of military defeat and public exhaustion. The Italian people, promised invincibility and eternal empire, now watched their cities burn from Allied bombing raids and felt the cold touch of hunger on their doorsteps. The Italian military itself was hollow. Generals spoke of loyalty and readiness, but discipline was evaporating like water from a hot stone. The army was tired, demoralized, and beginning to wonder whether the German alliance was worth the price it extracted. And hovering over everything was the knowledge that Sicily itself would be invaded within weeks, if not days. Kesselring's first task was not to plan a grand counter-offensive. It was to understand what he actually possessed and what could realistically be defended. He moved swiftly through the Italian commands, assessing strength, morale, and capability with the practiced eye of a veteran. What he found was sobering. German forces were thin on the ground, stretched across defensive positions that had been hastily improvised rather than carefully constructed. Italian units were increasingly unreliable. The Air Force had been gutted by years of attrition and the demands of other theaters. Yet Kesselring possessed something that raw manpower and combat-ready divisions could not provide: a mind shaped by the experience of both victory and defeat, and above all, a ruthless clarity about what was actually possible. He had commanded in retreat before. He understood the mathematics of defensive warfare, the way terrain could multiply a small force into something formidable if deployed with precision. If Germany abandoned the peninsula too quickly, if the collapse appeared catastrophic, then the psychological impact would ripple through the entire Nazi alliance system. Hungary, Romania, and other wavering partners would accelerate their own calculations of betrayal. But if Germany could hold, if it could demonstrate that the Wehrmacht could still bite back and extract a price from the Allies, then the situation might be stabilized long enough for other strategic opportunities to emerge. This was not optimism, it was calculation, and it was, in its way, a form of defiance. The invasion of Sicily came on the 10th of July 1943, and it brought into sharp focus everything Kesselring had feared. The Allies landed not at a single point, but across multiple beaches, overwhelming the thin coastal defenses with superior numbers and amphibious capability. American and British forces poured ashore in a display of coordinated power that Italian defences could not withstand for more than hours. Kesselring had already anticipated this outcome. He had positioned German reinforcements deeper inland, ready to contest the advance, rather than waste strength on beaches that could not be held. His orders to Italian commanders were blunt: fall back, regroup, and prepare for orderly defense rather than futile last stands. The speed of the Allied advance was shocking nonetheless. Within days, they had seized the airfields and broken the coherence of the coastal defense line. But they had not, as yet, defeated the German forces. They had merely pushed them back, and that was precisely what Kesselring had expected them to do. The real contest would come inland, where terrain favored defense, and where German tactical skill could still impose costs on the attacker. What Kesselring could not have fully predicted was the collapse of Italy itself. By mid-July, even as the Sicily campaign was still unfolding, the Italian political system began to convulse. Mussolini, long the symbol of Italian fascism and partnership with Germany, was overthrown by his own government. He was arrested, imprisoned, and then, in a strange reversal, rescued by German commandos in a daring raid that would become the stuff of legend. But the damage to German calculations was immense. The new Italian government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies. The Italian armed forces, no longer bound by the whip of fascist discipline, began to dissolve. Officers vanished, soldiers deserted, entire units simply ceased to exist as functioning military organizations. Kesselring watched this unfolding with cold fury and cold calculation in equal measure. It was a betrayal, but it was also an opportunity to consolidate complete German control over Italian territory and military resources. He moved with decisive speed. German forces seized key positions, disarmed Italian units, and established German military rule across significant portions of the peninsula. The invasion of the Italian mainland came on the 3rd of September 1943, when British forces crossed the Strait of Messina into Calabria. It was, in many ways, the moment of maximum danger for Kesselring's entire strategic vision. If the Allies could establish a secure beachhead on the mainland, if they could break out and drive toward Naples and the heart of Italy, then the entire peninsula could be cut off and the German forces encircled. But Kesselring had prepared for this contingency. He had positioned forces to delay the British advance in the south while maintaining a mobile reserve in the center of the peninsula. He had also ensured that German forces retained control of the strategic choke points, the mountain passes and river lines where defense could be made to stick. The British, methodical as always, advanced carefully. They faced tenacious German rear guards at every line of retreat, and progress was measured in kilometers captured per day, not the rapid sweeping advances that the Allies hoped for. Weeks passed. The summer turned toward autumn, and slowly, Kesselring's vision began to take shape. Italy would not be a quick campaign for the Allies. It would be a grinding, attritional struggle that would stretch their resources and demand constant reinforcement. The larger American invasion came on the 9th of September, when American forces landed at Salerno, south of Naples, in an attempt to outflank German forces and seize a major port. For a moment, the gamble seemed near to success. The American beachhead came close to being driven back into the sea by German counterattacks. But the Americans held, reinforced from the sea, and gradually expanded the beachhead. Kesselring recognized that Naples could not be held against simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. He gave the order to evacuate and prepare a fighting withdrawal northward. The prize city, once the jewel of southern Italy, was abandoned to the Allies. Kesselring's units pulled back in good order, destroying infrastructure and preparing the landscape itself as an instrument of defense. Nowhere in Europe was the Wehrmacht's mastery of defensive operations more evident than in what followed. Kesselring did not attempt to hold Naples or establish another fixed line where he lacked the resources to hold it indefinitely. Instead, he began a controlled retreat northward, trading space for time with the precision of a general who understood exactly what he was doing. As the autumn of 1943 deepened, Kesselring's strategic vision crystallized into something more concrete. He would not hold the entire peninsula. Doing so was simply impossible given the numerical superiority of the Allies and the collapse of Italian military capability. But he could hold key terrain. He could establish successive defensive lines running across the peninsula from sea to sea, with each line exploiting the natural geography of the Italian landscape. The Apennine Mountains, that great spine running the length of the peninsula, would become his ally. River valleys would become killing zones. Town by town, ridge by ridge, he would make the Allies pay for every kilometer of advance. This strategy had a name that would become infamous in the annals of military history: the Winter Line. But before the Winter Line came other positions, other defenses, other places where Kesselring's troops would stand and fight, and then fall back to fight again. The pattern was established in those autumn months, and it would define the Italian campaign for the next 20 months. Kesselring's rapid assessment of the Italian situation and his immediate actions revealed both his greatest strengths and the constraints he labored under. He could move forces with speed and confidence. He could read terrain and understand how to use it to multiply the effect of inferior numbers. He could maintain discipline and coherence even when the situation seemed chaotic and the larger strategic position was clearly deteriorating. But he could not create forces where none existed. He could not conjure supplies from thin air. He could not turn the clock backward and restore Italian military capability or Italian political stability. And he could not overcome, through tactical brilliance alone, the fundamental fact that the Allies had superior numbers, superior air power, and superior resources. What he could do was make the Allies fight for every kilometer, force them to bring reinforcements forward, stretch their supply lines, and impose costs that rippled backward through the entire structure of Allied command. In this, he would succeed more thoroughly than perhaps anyone in the German High Command had anticipated. The establishment of defensive lines and the preparation for the long struggle ahead represented Kesselring at his best and most formidable. He was no longer the optimistic air commander of the Western offensive, or even the beleaguered defender of North Africa. He had been forged by retreats and defeats, by the experience of fighting against enemies who grew stronger while he grew weaker, by the bitter knowledge that tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic disadvantage. Yet from this crucible emerged a commander whose reputation, at least among military professionals on both sides, would rise rather than fall. The Italians began to whisper that Kesselring was a master of defense, a general who could make mountains and rivers fight for Germany. The Allies learned to respect him, to understand that any sector of the line under his command would be more difficult, more costly, more psychologically taxing than the same terrain under lesser commanders. And in Rome and Berlin, even Hitler began to understand that Kesselring, whatever his ultimate fate, was one of the few men in the Wehrmacht who could be trusted with an impossible task and be depended upon to accomplish as much of it as was humanly possible. By the end of 1943, the fundamental parameters of the Italian campaign had been established. The Allies would advance. Kesselring would trade space for time. The war would continue in Italy for longer than anyone had anticipated, with no clear resolution in sight. Cities would fall and be rebuilt. Soldiers would die in grinding attritional warfare that seemed to have no end. And through it all, Kesselring would remain at his post, doing what had become his specialty, making the best of an increasingly desperate situation and extracting maximum cost from his enemies in the process. The stage for the Winter Line had been set, and Kesselring's true trial was about to begin. What came next would define not only the Italian campaign, but Kesselring's legacy as a commander of the Second World War. The defensive genius was about to face his greatest test, and the mountains of Italy would become the theatre in which his reputation would be forged into something that would outlast the Reich itself. By the autumn of 1943, the Axis position in Italy had collapsed with startling speed. Sicily had fallen in weeks. Mussolini, once a pillar of fascist Europe, had been removed from power and arrested. The Italian government, in a stunning reversal, had surrendered to the Allies and switched sides. What had begun as a German alliance with a powerful Mediterranean partner was now, from Berlin's perspective, a catastrophic betrayal. Kesselring stood at the edge of a precipice. To his north lay the remnants of the Wehrmacht, stretched thin across Europe. To his south came the Allies, American and British forces moving up the Italian Peninsula with growing momentum. Between them lay Kesselring and the forces under his command, fewer in number, diminishing in equipment, but about to demonstrate something that would confound the Allies for 18 months: the art of defensive warfare at its most refined and brutal. Kesselring arrived in Italy with a clear understanding of what he faced. The Allies possessed superiority in the air, at sea, and on the ground. They could call upon seemingly inexhaustible supplies from America. They had generals of proven capability, Alexander, Montgomery, and others who had earned their reputations across North Africa. Yet Italy, Kesselring recognized, was not Russia. It was not France. The peninsula itself was a gift to the defender. The spine of the Apennine Mountains ran down its length. Narrow valleys, steep slopes, and high ridges created natural strongpoints. Towns perched on hilltops. Beaches were limited. A commander with patience, ingenuity, and discipline could make the enemy pay dearly for every mile of advance. Kesselring possessed all three of these qualities in abundance. He also possessed something else: an unshakable belief that even a losing war could be fought in ways that served the cause, that slowed the enemy, that bought time for Hitler's fantastic weapons or his diplomatic miracles, illusions though they were. The concept that would become known as the Winter Line, or more formally the Gustav Line, emerged from this calculation. It was not built overnight, nor was it improvised. Rather, it represented a systematic application of German military engineering and tactical thinking. The line stretched from the Garigliano River on the west to the Sangro River on the east, cutting across the peninsula at its narrowest points. At its center stood Monte Cassino, a height of more than 1,700 meters that dominated the surrounding landscape and controlled the Liri Valley beyond it, the gateway to the Italian interior and eventually to Rome. The line itself consisted not of a simple trench system as in the First World War, but rather a series of interlocking fortified positions, each designed to support the others, each capable of independent defense if necessary. Bunkers were sited with precise attention to fields of fire. Anti-tank obstacles were concealed in ways that funneled attackers into killing zones. Artillery was positioned to rake valleys and ridgelines. Nothing was left to chance. The construction of these defenses consumed men and resources that Germany could barely spare. German engineers worked alongside Italian troops, still under German command, and pressed labor, both willing and unwilling, to turn the mathematical calculations of defensive warfare into concrete and steel. Miles of barbed wire were strung in patterns designed by experts in machine gun fire. Anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines, and improvised obstacles covered approaches to every strong point. Overlapping fields of fire meant that an attacker striking one position would be exposed to fire from several others. Reverse slopes were used to shelter reserves from aerial bombardment. Underground bunkers could withstand all but the heaviest artillery fire. The German army had learned hard lessons about defensive warfare across 2 continents, and now, finally, Kesselring had the chance to apply those lessons against an enemy advancing overland rather than trying to achieve breakthrough from the sea. The Allies struck the Winter Line for the first time in January of 1944. The 4th Indian Division, the 8th British Army, and American formations began their assault with confidence born of victory in North Africa and Sicily. They encountered something they had not fully anticipated: organized, systematic, and ferocious resistance. Where they expected breakthrough, they found stalemate. Where they pushed hard on one sector, German reserves appeared to seal the penetration. The terrain itself became an enemy almost as formidable as the Germans. Winter weather turned Italian roads to mud. Rain fell in torrents. Snow covered the high ground. Supply lines stretched backward across an increasingly difficult landscape. Men died not only from bullets and shells but from exposure, from dysentery, from the sheer grinding attrition of warfare in conditions of miserable cold and dampness. Kesselring moved among his units constantly, assessing, adjusting, encouraging. His commanders respected him, not because he was a soft touch or because he shielded them from reality, but because he understood their conditions and because his plans, though demanding, were based on careful assessment of what was actually possible rather than the fantasy orders that often descended from Berlin. He knew that his men were cold, exhausted, and aware that they were defending territory that the Reich could not hold indefinitely. Yet he also knew that every month they held this line was a month the Allies were not advancing elsewhere. Every casualty they inflicted on the enemy was a soldier not available for other operations. The longer the Allies were tied down in Italy, the longer Germany retained whatever strategic options remained to her. It was cold arithmetic, stripped of ideology and romance. Monte Cassino became the crucible of the Winter Line. The mountain itself had crowned its summit with a Benedictine monastery founded in the 6th century, a sacred place in Christian Europe. Monks still lived there when the Germans transformed the height into a fortress. The question of whether German forces actually occupied the monastery became a source of bitter controversy. The monastery, Kesselring determined, was not occupied militarily, though German positions ringed it closely. The Allies, convinced that Germans were firing from within it, ultimately decided the risk was too great. In February of 1944, American bombers dropped more than 250 tons of ordnance on the monastery. The medieval structure was reduced to rubble. Surviving monks were evacuated. When German troops later moved into the ruins to better defend that sector, the irony was complete. The Allies had destroyed the monastery to prevent the Germans from using it, and then the Germans used the ruins anyway. The abbey's destruction shocked world opinion and gained Kesselring a measure of respect even from enemies who recognized that he had faced an impossible situation with pragmatism rather than recrimination. The assault on Monte Cassino itself lasted for months. 4 separate major offensives were launched against it, each one more costly than the last. The 34th Division of the American Army threw itself against the slopes repeatedly, losing men with appalling casualty rates. The New Zealand Division attacked. British forces assaulted. Polish troops, determined to vindicate their honor on the mountains of Italy, launched a final assault that broke through in May of 1944. Yet even this breakthrough did not immediately collapse the German position. Kesselring's careful preparation meant that the loss of one position did not automatically unravel the entire line. His troops, depleted and exhausted, withdrew in good order to positions already prepared further back. The stubbornness of his defense earned something more than mere tactical respect from Allied commanders. It earned professional recognition. These were soldiers who fought well. This was a general who commanded well. The casualties accumulated on both sides, but the Allies advanced measured in kilometers while pouring in manpower and materiel that simply exceeded what Germany could match. By the spring of 1944, more than 200,000 Allied soldiers were committed to the Italian campaign. Aircraft by the hundreds appeared overhead, harassing German supply lines, striking at troop concentrations, and dominating the skies so completely that German air operations became almost impossible. German armor, already limited, was stretched thin across a front that kept expanding as the Allies widened their offensive. Reinforcements from Germany were decreasing as Hitler's military situation deteriorated on all fronts. The Russians were advancing in the east. The Americans and British were preparing the invasion of France. Every German soldier in Italy was potentially a soldier unavailable elsewhere. Kesselring was acutely aware that he was losing a losing game. Yet he was resolved that Italy would be lost slowly, methodically, extracting maximum cost for every meter of ground. The period from February through May of 1944 represented the peak of Kesselring's art as a defensive commander. His lines held. His men, despite lacking air cover, lacking sufficient artillery ammunition, lacking proper winter clothing and hot food, continued to resist. They conducted orderly withdrawals, trading space for time with a precision that frustrated Allied operational planners. Kesselring's reputation among his own officers reached its height during this period. He was seen as a commander who asked of his men what was possible, who understood their suffering, and who fought the battle as it was rather than as he wished it to be. German officers who served under him later spoke of this period with something approaching affection, despite the horror and hardship. He had maintained discipline, coherence, and tactical skill under circumstances that grew worse day by day. The human cost of the winter line was staggering. The Germans suffered perhaps 100,000 casualties during the 4 months of the line's most intensive fighting. The Allies suffered more, perhaps 130,000 casualties or more, across all the forces committed to breaking through. The monastery at Monte Cassino lay in ruins. Villages were destroyed. The landscape itself bore the scars of the artillery bombardment that both sides launched. Yet when it ended in May of 1944, it had achieved Kesselring's purpose in its narrowest sense. The Allies had been made to pay an enormous price for their advance, and that advance had been delayed by months that might have made a difference elsewhere. The breakthrough, when it came, opened routes northward that led eventually to Rome and beyond. But Rome, for all its historical and symbolic weight, fell to the Allies in early June of 1944, the same month that the Normandy invasion began. By that point, Italy had become secondary in the eyes of the world and in the calculations of Hitler's war machine. Kesselring, surveying the results of his handiwork, understood that the Winter Line had been a magnificent defensive achievement and an ultimate strategic failure. Such was the nature of defending a losing war. He had slowed the Allies, but he had not stopped them. He had inflicted casualties, but the Allies could replace them. He had preserved his army as a fighting force, but that army shrank with each engagement. The Gustav Line, the Winter Line, the series of fortified positions he had constructed with such care had worked exactly as designed. An outnumbered, outgunned defender, operating from prepared positions with interior lines of communication and the advantage of terrain, could make a larger, better supplied attacking force bleed. History had demonstrated this principle across centuries. Kesselring had demonstrated it again, more thoroughly and with greater tactical refinement than most commanders ever achieved. The cost was terrible. The achievement was real. The outcome was never in doubt. In the winter of 1943, as the year turned toward its end and snow began to fall on the Italian mountains, Albert Kesselring faced a problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. The Gustav Line, that formidable barrier of bunkers and prepared positions he had orchestrated into being, had held through the autumn and early winter months. But holding was no longer enough. Behind the Allied lines, fresh divisions arrived from North Africa, from Sicily, from across the Mediterranean. Supplies flowed northward in an ever-increasing tide. The Allies, for the first time in this southern campaign, possessed not merely equality, but clear numerical superiority in men, guns, and aircraft. Kesselring understood what this meant. The battle for Italy was becoming a battle of attrition, and attrition was a contest he could not win. Yet he would fight it anyway, with a method that combined ruthless calculation with an almost desperate hope that time itself might shift the political landscape that was turning so bitterly against Germany. The psychology of defensive warfare against a stronger opponent operates according to its own calculus, one that differs fundamentally from the open maneuver of attack. When you hold positions, you trade geographical space for temporal advantage. Every week the enemy fails to break through is a week in which other events elsewhere might change the equation of war. Kesselring had learned this principle through bitter experience on the Eastern Front, where he had watched German positions hold and hold and hold again, buying precious time as the desperate struggle in Russia consumed resources and attention. Now, in the mountains of central Italy, he applied this logic with meticulous precision. The winter line would not be a single position, but a series of them, layer upon layer, each one designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces, while remaining defensible with minimal resources. Behind the Gustav Line lay the Adolf Hitler Line. Behind that came other positions, names that would become synonymous with grinding, attritional fighting: the Gothic Line, the Green Line, the Dora Line, each one prepared with the same ruthless attention to terrain and fortification that had made the Gustav Line so costly to assault. The physical geography of the Italian Peninsula became Kesselring's greatest asset and, paradoxically, his greatest burden. The Apennine Mountains rise sharply from the coastal plains, creating a spine of high terrain that runs down the center of the peninsula like the backbone of some ancient creature. These mountains are not the sweeping, open highlands of Russia or the relatively gentle slopes of France. They are rugged, broken terrain, steep enough to exhaust infantry and tangled enough to fragment coordinated attacks. Villages cling to hillsides, roads snake through narrow valleys. Visibility is often limited to meters rather than kilometers. For an attacker with superior numbers, this terrain is a mixed blessing. Manpower advantage counts for less when units cannot move laterally along ridges or deploy in open ground. The defender, conversely, can position small forces to cover wide areas and gain time by forcing the enemy to root them out position by position. Kesselring saw this clearly. He understood that if he could make the Allies bleed enough, make them pay in casualties for every kilometer of advance, he could stretch their supply lines thin and slow their momentum to a crawl. He could trade space for time, and time, he hoped against hope, might bring salvation in some form. The actual mechanics of this defensive strategy required an almost Byzantine understanding of layered defense and the management of limited resources. Kesselring did not defend the Gustav Line by concentrating all his strength there. Instead, he distributed his forces according to a principle of flexible depth. Forward elements, often relatively lightly held, would absorb the initial assault and then fall back to secondary positions. This withdrawal was not panicked flight, but calculated maneuver, designed to draw the attacking force forward, extend its supply lines, disrupt its formation, and set it up for counterattack by reserves held further back. Machine gun positions were sighted to cover each other and cover the approaches to the next defensive line. Artillery was positioned not to remain static, but to shift between prepared locations, keeping the enemy's bombardment from achieving concentration. Reserves were held at road junctions where they could move quickly to threatened sectors. Kesselring emphasized constantly that the aim was not to hold ground, but to inflict casualties and preserve fighting strength. A position held at the cost of destroying the unit holding it served no purpose. A position evacuated in good order, with the defending force intact and moving toward the next prepared line, served the purpose of attrition perfectly. The transition from the winter of 1943 into the spring of 1944 illustrated both the logic and the limitation of this approach. The Allies, under the overall command of General Harold Alexander, mounted repeated attacks on the Gustav Line and its surrounding positions. Each attack gained ground in small increments. A village captured, a ridge seized, a bridgehead established across a river. Each attack cost casualties, often heavy ones. The logic of attritional warfare is that if your opponent is larger and better supplied than you are, and you force him to bleed for every advance, eventually the balance tips in your favor, not through your own success, but through his own cumulative exhaustion. But this logic contains a terrible fragility. It assumes that your opponent will eventually tire or pull forces away for other fronts. It assumes that you can sustain your own forces indefinitely against numerical pressure. It assumes that no single catastrophic breakthrough will occur that shatters your defensive structure entirely. By the spring of 1944, all three of these assumptions had begun to look questionable. The landing at Anzio in January 1944 had been designed precisely to break this attritional stalemate through an amphibious assault aimed at the German rear. In theory, this operation should have succeeded. The Americans and British who stormed ashore behind the German lines should have been able to march inland and link up with forces attacking from the south, trapping German defenders in a pincers. Kesselring, however, responded with speed and tactical sophistication. He contained the beachhead with local forces and then rapidly brought up reserves from other sectors. The Anzio beachhead, which was meant to be a hammer, became instead another position to defend. The Germans conducted repeated counterattacks, attempting to drive the Allies back into the sea. These attacks failed, but they also prevented the Allies from using Anzio as a springboard for rapid exploitation. Paradoxically, for Kesselring, this was a defensive victory. The Allies had expanded their foothold through the winter and early spring, but not by the dramatic margins that the operation had sought. Kesselring's defensive lines bent but did not break. Forces from Anzio, instead of racing inland to create chaos, found themselves locked in static positional warfare, feeding piecemeal into a grinding consumption of resources. The beachhead became another problem to solve through attrition rather than a catastrophe to escape through desperate maneuver. Yet the very fact that Kesselring had to respond to Anzio reveals the fundamental pressure under which his command operated. The Allies did not attack on a single front. They pressed forward simultaneously from the south and from the sea. This meant that German reserves, always in short supply, had to be stretched across multiple threatened sectors. It meant that Kesselring could not accumulate overwhelming force at any single point of decision. It meant that defensive success in one sector often came at the cost of vulnerability in another. This was the trap of defending a long line with insufficient resources. You can parry one blow, but the next comes while you are extending your arm to recover from the first. German reinforcements arrived, but not in the quantities that Kesselring requested. The Reich was being pressed elsewhere, in Russia, where the Soviets launched offensives of their own, and in the West, where the Allies were preparing for the invasion of France. Resources had to be divided among competing theatres. Italy, despite its significance, was not the primary focus of German military effort. It was a place where Germany was already losing, where resources poured in could only slow the loss, not reverse it. From Berlin, the calculations were cold and brutal. If you had to lose territory, better to lose it slowly in Italy, while preserving strength for the primary theatres. Kesselring grasped this reality with clear-eyed realism. He did not expect to be reinforced sufficiently to drive the Allies back into the sea. He did not expect to be provided with the resources to launch a general offensive that would recover lost territory. He adapted his operational objectives to match the resources available to him, which is the mark of a commander who understands the difference between wishes and possibilities. His goal became not victory, but the preservation of organized military force and the extraction of maximum cost from the enemy for every advance. In the mountains of central Italy, these objectives were achievable. The terrain worked in his favor. His engineers constructed fortifications with skill and efficiency. His troops, many of them veterans of long campaigns, understood how to defend. The alpine terrain meant that mobility was limited for both sides, but particularly for the Allies, with their greater dependence on mechanized transport and logistical vehicles. Kesselring took advantage of this. He used roads as defensive features, positioning anti-tank guns and mines to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. He held the high ground, making the Allies assault uphill against prepared defenses. He established his forces in depth so that the capture of one position did not result in a breakthrough, but merely the beginning of the assault against the next prepared line. The spring of 1944 saw repeated attempts by Allied forces to crack the German defensive lines, most dramatically in the assault on the town of Monte Cassino and its surrounding heights. The monastery that crowned the summit became a symbol of the struggle, and the repeated assaults against its position became a synonym for attritional warfare. Kesselring did not command directly at the tactical level of these battles, but he created the conditions for them. He positioned forces where terrain provided maximum defensive advantage. He ensured that enough reserves existed to contain breakthroughs. He coordinated the defense of the surrounding sector so that German units could support each other across the mountainous terrain. The result was a battle that consumed vast quantities of ammunition and manpower for a result that measured progress in hundreds of meters. This was attrition in its purest form. The Allies won the battle, eventually, but the cost was enormous. The Germans fell back to new positions prepared in advance. The Allies advanced, but not by strategic distances. The pattern repeated month after month through the spring and into the summer of 1944. Behind these tactical patterns lay a larger strategic reality that even Kesselring's skill could not alter. The Allies, despite the grinding nature of the Italian campaign, were pouring increasing resources into operations elsewhere. In June, even as fierce fighting continued on the Winter Line and in the mountains beyond it, the Great Invasion of Normandy launched on the coast of France. This event, while not directly affecting the fighting in Italy, transformed the overall equation of the war. Now the Allies faced two major German armies in two major theatres. Germany had to defend both. The resources to do so simply did not exist. The invasion of Normandy succeeded, where the invasion of Italy threatened to fail, precisely because the terrain in Normandy permitted rapid exploitation of initial success. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, the Allies had built up a force that began to push eastward toward Germany itself. This meant that Kesselring's campaign in Italy, which he had been fighting on the assumption that time was working for Germany, suddenly faced a new reality. Time was running out, not running in Germany's favor. By the summer of 1944, Kesselring's command had essentially settled into a routine of defensive warfare that would continue until the collapse of Nazi Germany itself. The lines would shift and shift again, but the fundamental character of the campaign changed little. Kesselring would trade space for time, extracting maximum casualties while preserving his forces, establishing new defensive positions as old ones became untenable. The Gothic Line, that great fortification across the Apennines prepared in the summer of 1944, would become his next great defensive position, but it would function according to the same principles. The Allies would attack, sometimes succeeding in breaching the line, and Kesselring would fall back to prepared positions, conduct counterattacks to prevent exploitation, and then settle into another phase of grinding attrition. The hope that time might bring salvation had faded by this point, though it never entirely disappeared from Kesselring's calculations. But hope, he was learning, was a luxury that a commander could not afford. What remained was duty, discipline, and the grim determination to preserve organized military order in the face of overwhelming odds. In the mountains of Italy, through the summer and autumn and winter of 1944, this is what Kesselring delivered. The legacy of this phase of Kesselring's command was complex and contradictory. He had succeeded in slowing the Allied advance in Italy to a degree that probably exceeded what any other German commander could have achieved. The defensive lines he constructed and the tactical principles he employed were studied by military institutions for decades afterward as examples of how an outnumbered force might impose costs on a superior enemy. But he had also been fighting a campaign that was inherently unwinnable in any meaningful sense. The Allies would eventually break through all his lines and advance northward. Germany would lose the war. The territory that he had preserved for months of additional fighting would in the end be lost regardless. This raises the eternal question of military command. Is it a success to delay the inevitable, or is it merely postponement of defeat? Kesselring himself never apologized for the answer he gave, never expressed regret at the casualties inflicted in pursuit of a defensive strategy he knew could not ultimately succeed. He had fought the war as it presented itself to him, with the resources available to him, against an enemy who could not be beaten. In doing so, he had revealed something essential about his character as a commander. He was not a man who needed to win to justify his actions. He was a man who needed to fight with competence and discipline, to preserve order and military virtue, even in the face of inevitable defeat. By the late summer of 1944, Field Marshal Kesselring faced a military reality that demanded both ruthlessness and imagination. The Winter Line, that brutal chain of fortifications anchored on Monte Cassino, had finally been penetrated by relentless Allied pressure. Months of attritional warfare had worn down his forces, and the strategic map of Italy was shifting in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could fully arrest. Yet Kesselring understood something fundamental about mountain warfare that many commanders failed to grasp. Terrain itself could be weaponized. The Apennine Mountains, that spinal cord of rock and altitude running the length of the peninsula, offered him a second chance to impose delay and suffering on his enemies. If he could not win decisively, he could make the Allies bleed for every meter of Italian soil they conquered. The Gothic Line, as it came to be known, was Kesselring's answer to inevitable retreat. Unlike the Winter Line, which had been designed years earlier as a static defense of the Italian mainland, the Gothic Line was conceived as a mobile, mountainous barrier that could exhaust and frustrate advancing forces. It stretched for more than 200 kilometers across the narrowest part of the Italian Peninsula, from the Tyrrhenian Sea in the west to the Adriatic in the east, cutting through terrain so hostile and vertical that mechanized warfare became nearly impossible. Kesselring chose positions not merely for their defensibility, but for their psychological impact on the attacker. High peaks, narrow valleys, and restricted road networks transformed the Apennines into a natural fortress that required patient dismantling rather than rapid breakthrough. This was the terrain of World War I Alpine warfare, the kind of grinding mountain combat that consumed men and time in equal measure. Kesselring, who had studied military history throughout his career, recognized that he was constructing not a line, but a series of interlocking fiefdoms of rock and fortification. The construction of the Gothic Line represents one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the entire European war. German and Italian labor, supplemented by conscripted civilians, worked feverishly through the summer and early autumn to dig trenches, build pillboxes, clear fields of fire, and position artillery on peaks that overlooked every potential avenue of approach. Kesselring demanded that each position be mutually supporting, so that attacking forces could not isolate and eliminate strongpoints one by one. The use of interlocking fields of fire meant that every advance required the assault of multiple positions simultaneously, which demanded coordination, concentration, and resources that even the wealthy Allies found difficult to marshal. Concrete fortifications were poured on heights where the temperature dropped below freezing, requiring special winter construction techniques. Supply lines had to be established through narrow mountain passes, making every German position vulnerable to interdiction, but also making every advance by the Allies an exercise in logistics as much as combat. By the time the Gothic Line was substantially complete, it represented months of unceasing labor under difficult conditions and the constant threat of air attack. What distinguished Kesselring's approach to the Gothic Line was his understanding that it could never be held in perpetuity. This was not the Maginot Line, doomed because it was too rigid and too dependent on a single strategic assumption. Instead, Kesselring created what modern military theorists would recognize as an active, resilient defense in depth. Behind the forward positions lay secondary lines, behind those lay tertiary positions, and behind all of them lay the possibility of further withdrawal into the Alpine foothills. He established multiple defensive belts, each one designed to absorb attack, inflict casualties, and then either hold or fall back in good order to the next prepared position. German doctrine called this organized withdrawal, a discipline that required officers and men who could maintain formation and cohesion while retreating under pressure. Kesselring spent considerable effort training his troops in this counterintuitive skill, knowing that the alternative was panicked rout and the loss of entire units. He understood that a fighting withdrawal that preserves forces is often more valuable than a static defense that results in encirclement and destruction. The Gothic Line offensive began in late August 1944, when British and American forces under Field Marshal Harold Alexander finally pushed forward in strength against Kesselring's new barrier. The initial assault came against the western sector of the line, where British forces under General Oliver Leese attacked toward the Arno Valley and the approaches to Florence. German defenders, positioned on high ground with prepared fortifications and clear fields of fire, inflicted heavy casualties on the British advance. The Allies discovered quickly that the mountain terrain negated much of their armoured superiority and made the application of their overwhelming air power difficult. Close air support became less effective when targets were dug into reverse slopes or concealed in valleys where aircraft could not effectively deliver ordnance. Artillery, traditionally the strongest arm in the Allied arsenal, had to be positioned on heights that themselves came under German fire, and the difficulties of supply through mountain passes limited the weight and frequency of bombardment. The Allies, accustomed to rapid maneuver and overwhelming firepower, found themselves in an attritional contest that favored the defender with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Kesselring's presence on the Italian front during this period was magnetic and focused. Unlike some senior commanders who remained distant from the fighting, he moved frequently among his units, assessing conditions, identifying weak points, and ensuring that his orders were understood and executed. His relationship with his troops was complex. He was respected for his tactical acumen, but feared for his demands and his unwavering commitment to holding positions or executing organized withdrawals. He had a reputation for relieving commanders who failed to meet his standards, which meant that officers in his command understood the consequences of collapse or panic. Yet he was not a martinet who ignored reality or demanded the impossible. When a position became untenable because of flanking movements or resource exhaustion, he authorized withdrawal to the next prepared line. This combination of unyielding standards and tactical flexibility allowed him to maintain unit cohesion even as his overall position deteriorated. The defense of the Gothic Line through the autumn and winter of 1944 became a masterclass in mountain warfare conducted under conditions of material inferiority. The Allies possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers, artillery, armor, and air power, yet the terrain and Kesselring's skillful disposition of forces meant that none of these advantages could be brought to bear simultaneously. The Allies found themselves fighting a series of separate battles, each in a confined space where the mountains restricted maneuver and limited the employment of their mechanized forces. Artillery pieces had to be man-handled up slopes to establish new firing positions. Supply lines stretched across narrow paths that became quagmires in rain or impassable under snow. Airfields were distant from the fighting, making air support less responsive to tactical needs. Meanwhile, German defenders could rely on shorter supply lines, pre-positioned ammunition and supplies, and the defensive advantages of prepared positions. The balance of advantage, so overwhelmingly in the Allies' favor in open terrain, became nearly even in these mountain fastnesses. Specific engagements along the Gothic Line reflect the nature of this mountain combat. The battle for the High Apennines, involving American and Polish units fighting toward the medieval town of Rimini on the Adriatic coast, consumed weeks and thousands of casualties for relatively modest territorial gains. German defenders, operating from fortified positions on heights that overlooked every approach, exacted a terrible price for each advance. The terrain was so difficult that mules and mountain infantry often proved more effective than tanks and motorized columns. Weather conditions deteriorated as autumn turned into winter, adding another adversary to the already fearsome challenge of mountain warfare. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures affected both attacker and defender, but defenders in fortified positions with supply lines running through mountain passes had greater ability to endure than attackers operating in the exposed heights. The Allies found that momentum, that most precious commodity in warfare, evaporated in the thin air of the Apennines. The resources available to Kesselring were declining with each passing month, a reality that constrained his strategic options even as his defensive success continued. Hitler, still imagining vast counter-offensives and the recapture of Rome, demanded men and equipment that Kesselring could not spare without fatally weakening his front. German industry, under constant bombardment from Allied air forces, could no longer replace vehicles, weapons, and ammunition at the rate they were consumed. Italian forces, demoralized and increasingly deficient in equipment and supplies, were becoming a liability rather than an asset. The replacement troops arriving from the Reich were often poorly trained and lacked the experience of veterans. Artillery ammunition became increasingly rationed, limiting the weight of fire that Kesselring could bring to bear in response to Allied attacks. Fuel shortages meant that vehicles had to be used sparingly, and the motorized columns that had once been the backbone of German maneuver warfare were increasingly immobilized. Kesselring adapted by emphasizing prepared positions and defensive firepower that relied less on mobility and more on the static advantages of terrain and fortification. The human cost of the Gothic Line campaign was severe for both sides, a grinding attritional struggle that produced casualties far out of proportion to the territorial changes it produced. German defenders, outnumbered and short of resources, suffered heavy losses that could not be replaced. Young soldiers, some barely trained, were thrown into mountainous terrain where confusion and chaos often reigned, and where the traditional advantages of German military organization could not be fully exploited. The intensity of artillery bombardments and close-quarter combat in the mountains created casualty rates among assault troops that exceeded those of the Western Front. The Allies, despite their material advantages, also paid a heavy price for every objective captured. Mountain warfare absorbed resources and lives at rates that strategic calculations had not anticipated. The months of fighting through the Gothic Line produced casualties that numbered in the hundreds of thousands across both sides, making it one of the costliest campaigns of the entire Mediterranean War. As 1944 turned toward 1945, the strategic situation continued its inexorable deterioration from Kesselring's perspective. The Western Allies, having broken out of Normandy and liberated France, were now approaching the Rhine and preparing their final assault on German territory. In the east, Soviet forces were advancing westward, having driven past Warsaw and approaching the Vistula. The Third Reich was being crushed in a massive vise, with the Allies closing from west and east simultaneously. Kesselring's defense in Italy, however skillfully conducted, could not alter this broader reality. He was fighting to preserve his army and maintain some semblance of organized resistance, but he was no longer fighting for victory. The Gothic Line represented the last great effort to impose delay and exaction of cost on the advancing Allies, a rearguard action that was inevitably destined to fail even as it succeeded tactically. Kesselring's defense of the Gothic Line earned him respect even from his opponents. Allied commanders recognized that they were fighting a skilled and determined enemy who understood the terrain, maintained discipline among his forces, and wielded the instruments of defense with considerable sophistication. The months of fighting in the Apennines demonstrated that despite overwhelming material superiority and numerical advantage, rapid victory was not possible against a commander of Kesselring's caliber operating from defensive positions in terrain that negated many Allied advantages. Military historians would later examine the Gothic Line as a case study in how material disadvantage could be partially offset by superior tactical skill, intelligent use of terrain, and an enemy that did not always make optimal use of its advantages. The campaign also showed the limits of defensive warfare. Despite Kesselring's brilliance, the steady accumulation of casualties, the erosion of resources, and the strategic collapse elsewhere meant that the Gothic Line could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. By the spring of 1945, even Kesselring's defensive genius could not preserve Italian resistance against the final Allied assault that would sweep northward through the peninsula and into the Alpine redoubt, where the regime would finally collapse. By the autumn of 1944, Albert Kesselring stood at the center of a widening catastrophe. His command in Italy remained intact, his defensive lines still holding against the Allies, yet the world around him was collapsing. To the north, German forces were in full retreat across France. To the east, the Soviet armies had swept through Poland and were now approaching the borders of the Reich itself. The vast German war machine that had once dominated Europe from the Atlantic to the Black Sea was contracting, pulling inward, fighting on multiple fronts with fewer guns, fewer men, and fewer aircraft than it had possessed months or even weeks before. Kesselring, now commanding not only his forces in Italy but increasingly coordinating with other theatre commanders as the strategic situation deteriorated, found himself in an impossible position. He was a competent military officer trying to function within a system that had become fundamentally irrational. The gap between what Hitler demanded and what military reality permitted was widening into an abyss. The resource crisis was the most immediate and pressing problem. Every weapon, every round of ammunition, every gallon of fuel that Kesselring's armies in Italy required had to be transported across the increasingly hostile expanse of Europe. The railways that had once reliably delivered supplies from Germany through Austria and into Italy were now targets for Allied bombing campaigns. Partisan groups, particularly in Yugoslavia, attacked convoys and supply lines with growing frequency and coordination. By late 1944, the German logistics system was hemorrhaging. Tank divisions that should have received new vehicles received instead a fraction of what they needed. Artillery units had ammunition rationed to only a few rounds per day. Infantrymen were being issued uniforms made of substitute materials because the factories producing proper military cloth had been destroyed by air raids. Kesselring's armies were eating into their reserves like a man spending down his savings while knowing that his income had permanently ceased. Every defensive line he constructed, every position he reinforced, consumed materials that could never be fully replaced. The manpower situation was equally dire, though for different reasons. Kesselring did not lack for soldiers in any absolute sense. Germany still fielded millions of men under arms across all theatres, but the quality and age of those men were changing in ways that no amount of training could remedy. Young men born in the 1920s who had formed the backbone of the Wehrmacht in the early war years were mostly dead, disabled, or scattered across the shrinking German territory. In their place came younger recruits, increasingly pulled from Hitler Youth organizations, often with minimal training. In Italy and across the southern European theatre, Kesselring also relied heavily on Italian forces, yet Italian reliability had become questionable since the collapse of Mussolini's regime and the chaotic Italian surrender of 1943. German soldiers had to be stationed to watch the Italians at times, a wasteful duplication of manpower that reduced the overall combat effectiveness of the front. Kesselring was trying to hold a vast defensive perimeter with an army that was simultaneously shrinking in quantity and declining in quality. The destruction inflicted by Allied air power was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of the resource crisis. By 1944, German air defense was nearly non-existent over most of Italy. American and British aircraft operated with virtual impunity, striking at airfields, supply depots, road networks, and rail junctions at will. Kesselring had virtually no fighters to oppose them. The aircraft that should have been defending the airspace over his command were needed desperately in defense of the German homeland itself. Hitler, in his desperation to stop the bombing campaign over the Reich, increasingly diverted every available aircraft and every unit of anti-aircraft defense northward. Kesselring watched helplessly as daylight convoys were attacked, as ammunition depots burned, as fuel supplies were destroyed before they could reach his armies. The Allies, with their abundance of aircraft and fuel, could afford to conduct operations with a lavishness that the Germans could only watch with impotent frustration. This disparity in resources was not simply a matter of material superiority. It represented a fundamentally different war. The Allies were fighting a rich nation's war, with waste accepted as the cost of speed and certainty. Germany was fighting a poor nation's war. Every shell counted, every gallon of fuel rationed. It was against this backdrop of mounting material scarcity that Hitler's demands became increasingly detached from military reality. The Führer, now spending most of his time in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, increasingly reliant on medications and surrounded by sycophants, issued orders that reflected his political ideology rather than strategic necessity. In 1944, Hitler became obsessed with the idea of defending every inch of German territory, or every conquered territory, indefinitely. He issued orders forbidding voluntary withdrawals. He demanded that positions be held to the last man, rather than conducting tactical retreats that might preserve an army for future operations. For Kesselring and other senior commanders, these orders created an intolerable conflict between their duty to obey and their professional judgment about how to preserve their armies and achieve military objectives. Kesselring, who had built a reputation as an effective operational commander, now found that his advice was increasingly ignored. When he proposed withdrawing to shorter, more defensible lines, Hitler suspected betrayal. When he reported on shortages of supplies or manpower, Hitler questioned his commitment or his statistics. The old relationship between command authority and military expertise was breaking down. The psychological strain on Kesselring became evident to those who worked with him, though he maintained his composure in most circumstances. Unlike some German commanders who became openly contemptuous of Hitler or who engaged in increasingly dangerous acts of resistance, Kesselring attempted to navigate the impossible demands through bureaucratic persistence and professional adaptation. He would submit reports in careful, precise language, documenting the shortages and the realities of the situation, hoping that the weight of evidence would eventually convince Hitler to accept more realistic strategic objectives. He would propose alternatives to Hitler's orders, phrasing them in ways that suggested they were actually fulfilling the Führer's intentions more effectively. This required considerable diplomatic skill and no small amount of moral compromise. Kesselring was not a member of the resistance movement and did not participate in the plot against Hitler, yet he also was not a blind enthusiast, and the strain of attempting to serve a regime whose demands were becoming increasingly impossible to fulfill was evident in his correspondence and in the memories of those who served under him. The collapse of German forces in other theatres added another layer of pressure to Kesselring's position. Following the failure of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, German reserves were essentially exhausted. The Eastern Front was contracting rapidly as Soviet armies advanced deeper into German territory. In February 1945, as Kesselring was still attempting to hold the Gothic Line and subsequent defensive positions in Italy, German forces were being pushed back across the Rhine in the west. The strategic picture had become one of unambiguous German defeat. It was no longer a question of whether Germany would lose the war, but rather how quickly the defeat would come and how much additional suffering it would cause. Kesselring, as a senior commander, could read the strategic situation as clearly as anyone. He knew that the war was lost, yet he continued to issue orders for defensive operations, to organize positions, to attempt to maintain discipline and military coherence among his forces. This was partly habit, partly professional obligation, and partly the simple reality that surrendering his command without orders was not something a German officer could do without facing execution. The specific military situation in Italy itself remained fluid and demanding throughout 1944 and into 1945. After the breakthrough at Anzio and the fall of Rome in June 1944, the Allies were expecting rapid progress up the Italian peninsula. Instead, Kesselring had managed to stabilize the front and even contain the Allied advance through skillful use of terrain and timely reinforcements. By the autumn, the Allies were facing the same kinds of logistical and manpower constraints that plagued the Germans, and the campaign had bogged down into an attritional grind. Kesselring's defensive lines were holding, which seemed a remarkable achievement given the overall collapse of German military power elsewhere. This success in Italy, however, came at the cost of drawing down resources that were needed elsewhere and tying down German divisions that could have been used in a desperate last stand in defense of the homeland. Kesselring was winning a tactical battle in Italy while losing the war in Germany. The very success of his defensive campaign contributed to the overall strategic disaster. By 1945, Kesselring was essentially managing the orderly retreat of a defeated force. The Allies were building up their strength for a final major offensive that would break through his lines and sweep northward toward Germany. Kesselring knew this offensive was coming and knew that he had insufficient strength to stop it decisively. His strategy, such as it could be called, was to delay as long as possible while withdrawing northward in phases, hoping to preserve his army as an organized force rather than allowing it to be destroyed in place. This meant fighting defensive battles on prepared lines, conducting withdrawals under pressure, and attempting to maintain discipline as the wider German military and political system collapsed around him. His orders from Berlin became increasingly surreal. Hitler demanded that certain positions be held at any cost, while simultaneously demanding that other positions be reinforced, when the resources to do either did not exist. Kesselring had to make choices about which orders he could partially fulfill and which he would have to ignore or reinterpret in ways that preserved his army. The morale of Kesselring's troops during this period varied significantly depending on unit and location. Some German soldiers had become fatalistic, aware that the war was lost and simply wishing to survive to its end. Others remained ideologically committed or had been trained to obey orders without question. Some Italian units were increasingly unreliable, with soldiers deserting or refusing to fight. The presence of SS units, which were sometimes placed in positions where they could prevent retreats by shooting soldiers who attempted to withdraw, added to the sense of coercion and desperation. Kesselring attempted to maintain discipline through a combination of traditional military authority and, when necessary, harsh measures. He was not known for excessive brutality compared to some other German commanders, but he was also not squeamish about executing order. He had to maintain an army that was holding together through a combination of habit, fear, and the absence of any realistic alternative. The Wehrmacht in Italy during 1944 and 1945 was a machine running on fumes, kept in motion by professional military officers like Kesselring, who had invested their entire adult lives in the German military system. The relationship between Kesselring and Hitler became increasingly strained as the war progressed toward its catastrophic conclusion. Kesselring was one of the few senior commanders who maintained relatively direct contact with the Führer and he continued to attempt to influence strategic decisions through reasoned argument and detailed reports. Hitler, by contrast, was becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable. He suspected that commanders were not fully committed to the war effort, that they were holding back reserves or planning to surrender prematurely. Kesselring had to walk a difficult line between telling Hitler truths that the Führer did not want to hear and maintaining his position and his life. There were moments when Kesselring had to consider whether expressing his actual views about the military situation might result in his arrest on charges of defeatism or conspiracy. This was not paranoia on Kesselring's part. Other generals had been arrested or purged for expressing pessimistic assessments of German prospects. The loyalty to Hitler that had once been a source of advancement for military officers had become a dangerous liability if it was perceived as insufficient. As 1945 began, Kesselring's command in Italy was being consolidated with his other responsibilities in the southern European theatre. He was nominally subordinate to various command structures, but in practice, he was one of the most powerful German military commanders remaining in the field because his armies were still organized, still holding territory, and still relatively intact compared to German forces elsewhere. The final chapter of German military power in the Mediterranean and southern Europe would largely be written by Kesselring's decisions and his attempts to preserve order as the Nazi regime reached its final days. The impossible demands of a failing dictator